Sometimes the hardest thing we ever do is give away the one thing standing between us and certain death. For Olynde Marrin, that moment came when two terrified young girls appeared at her cabin door, running from something she couldn't see but understood all too well. She gave them her last horse and sent them down the mountain, knowing she might never leave that wilderness again. 15 years she'd lived alone in the high country, escaping a violent past and asking nothing from the world. Now the world had found her. At dawn, 200 armed men rode into the valley below, led by a father searching for his lost daughters. He was a man the territory believed dead, and he remembered exactly who Olynde used to be. What connects this solitary woman to the ghost now riding toward her door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana High Country doesn't forgive mistakes. Olynde Marrin had learned that truth through 15 winters of solitude, and she carried it in her bones the way some women carry memories of children or the weight of wedding rings long since removed. Her cabin sat at 8,000 feet, tucked against a granite face that blocked the worst of the northern winds. She'd built it herself that first autumn, working through September and October with an urgency born of knowing what November would bring. The logs were weathered now, grey as the rocks around them, and the whole structure seemed to have grown from the mountain itself rather than being imposed upon it. She rose before dawn most mornings, when the world held that peculiar stillness that comes just before the birds begin. Her routine had the precision of ritual. Fire first, built from kindling she kept dry in a tin box by the hearth. Coffee next, grounds measured from the small supply she rationed through the year. She allowed herself 1 cup, no more, and drank it, standing at the single window that faced east, watching the sun climb over the distant peaks. The cabin was spare. A rope bed in one corner, a table she'd planed from a fallen pine, 2 chairs, though she never had visitors, shelves holding preserved food in mason jars, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Her possessions could be counted. 1 rifle, well-maintained, a revolver that had seen better days, 3 changes of clothes, a few books she'd read so many times, the pages had gone soft as cloth. Beneath a loose floorboard near the bed, wrapped in oilcloth, she kept things she tried not to look at. A tin daguerreotype, a folded letter, a cavalry officer's journal with a leather cover gone dark with age and handling. The daguerreotype showed a younger woman herself at 42, lean and severe in a nurse's uniform that was more military than medical. Around her stood a group of men in mismatched uniforms, armed with rifles and revolvers, their faces carrying that particular hardness that comes from killing and expecting to be killed. It had been taken in 1861, during what the newspapers had called the border conflicts, though those who'd fought in them knew they'd been small wars with large consequences. She'd served as a field nurse, but that title hadn't fully captured what she'd done. She'd set bones and extracted bullets, yes, but she'd also scouted, carried messages through enemy territory, and on 3 occasions that still visited her in dreams, she'd killed men who would have killed her first. The journal belonged to Bram Reddick, though she'd never returned it to him and suspected he'd long since stopped expecting it back. His handwriting filled the pages, neat at first, growing more erratic as the months of conflict wore on. He documented everything: troop movements, supply shortages, the names of men who died under his command. And on certain pages, marked with small crosses in the margins, he'd written about the decisions that had cost him everything. Olynde rarely opened the journal anymore. She knew what it contained, and remembering served no purpose except to remind her why she'd chosen this mountain, this isolation, this slow fade into obscurity. Her days followed patterns she'd established through trial and error. Morning was for checking the trap line that ran along the creek below her cabin. She'd learned to trap efficiently, taking only what she needed and releasing anything too young or too old. Rabbits, mostly, sometimes marten, once a season perhaps a deer. if she could make the shot clean and far enough from the cabin that the smell of butchering wouldn't linger. She wasted nothing. Meat was preserved, smoked, or dried. Hides were cured and either kept for repairs or, once a year, traded at a cash point she'd established 10 miles down the mountain, where a prospector named Samuels left supplies in exchange for her furs. Afternoons were for gathering. She knew the mountain intimately now, knew where the wild onions grew in spring, where to find the berries that wouldn't poison you, which mushrooms could be trusted and which would kill you in hours. She'd planted a small garden in a sheltered spot south of the cabin, but the growing season was short at this elevation, and she'd learned not to depend on it. The mountain provided if you paid attention and asked for nothing extra. Evenings were the hardest. That was when the silence pressed closest, when the absence of human voices became a physical thing she could almost touch. She'd tried singing to herself those first few years, but her voice sounded foreign in the quiet, and she'd stopped. Instead, she read by firelight, or worked on some small task, mending clothes, sharpening tools, braiding rope from dried grass. She went to bed when full dark came, rising again before dawn, and the cycle continued. She was 57 now, though she'd stopped marking birthdays after the first 5 years. Her body had changed with the life. She was leaner than she'd ever been, her hands calloused and strong, her face weathered by wind and sun until she looked older than her years. Her hair had gone mostly grey, and she kept it cut short with a knife, practical and unadorned. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy, and energy was survival. There were moments rare, but they came when she wondered if she'd stayed too long, if the mountain had taken more than she'd meant to give. She'd come here to escape what she'd done, the testimony she'd given, the man she'd helped destroy. She'd come here because after the tribunal, after watching Bram Reddick stripped of his command and exiled from the territories, she couldn't bear to remain among people who looked at her as either hero or traitor, depending on which version of the story they believed. The truth, as she tried to explain to anyone who would listen, was that both versions were true. Bram had ordered the raid on the settlement at Crane's Hollow. That was fact. He'd been told there were enemy combatants using it as a base, and the intelligence had been solid enough that 3 other commanders had agreed with his assessment. Olynde had been there that night, had ridden with the militia as they surrounded the collection of houses and barns in the hour before dawn. She'd been there when Bram called for surrender, when shots were fired from inside the settlement, when his men returned fire and the whole situation turned into chaos lit by burning buildings. She'd also been there when the smoke cleared and they'd found the bodies. 12 combatants, armed and hostile, and 7 civilians who'd either been caught in crossfire or unable to escape the flames. 3 of them children. Bram had been devastated. She'd seen it in his face, watched him walk among the dead with an expression of such profound grief that she'd almost believed it would break him. But when the tribunal convened 3 weeks later, when they asked him if he'd exercise more caution in the future, he'd looked them in the eye and said he'd make the same decision again with the same intelligence. The combatants had been real. The threat had been real. He couldn't have known about the civilians. Olynde had been called to testify about what she'd witnessed. She'd told the truth, that she'd warned Bram about the possibility of civilians, that he'd acknowledged her concern, but determined the military necessity outweighed the risk, that the children had died because the settlement had been set ablaze in the fighting. She'd also testified that she believed Bram was a good commander, who'd made a reasonable tactical decision with incomplete information. It hadn't mattered. The tribunal wanted someone to blame, and Bram Reddick became that person. He was stripped of command, expelled from the territories, forbidden from holding any military or governmental position. She'd heard he'd gone south, maybe to Mexico, maybe further. The last she'd known for certain was that his wife had died a year after the tribunal, and his 2 young daughters had been sent to live with relatives. And Olynde had come to the mountain. She told herself in those early years that she'd done the right thing, that telling the truth was always right, even when it cost someone everything. But as the years passed and the silence accumulated, she'd begun to wonder if there was a difference between truth and righteousness, and if she'd confused the two. The mountain didn't judge. It simply existed, indifferent to her guilt or her justifications. It killed you if you made mistakes and sustained you if you paid attention. There was honesty in that, a purity she'd found nowhere else. She was checking her snares on an October afternoon when she first felt that something had changed. It was nothing she could name, the animals behaving strangely perhaps, or a quality to the light that seemed off. She'd learned to trust these instincts. The mountain spoke in subtle languages, and ignoring them was how people died. She returned to the cabin earlier than usual, taking time to scan the approaches from her vantage point. Nothing visible, but the feeling persisted. She brought in extra firewood, checked her rifle, made sure her supplies were organized. Old habits from the war years, preparations that probably meant nothing but cost little to perform. That night, she barely slept. She kept the fire low and sat in the darkness, listening. Once, near midnight, she heard something large moving through the brush below the cabin. Could have been elk. Probably was elk. But she stayed awake until dawn regardless. The sun rose clear and cold on what would prove to be the last day of her isolation, though she couldn't have known it then. She stood at her window with her single cup of coffee, watching the light spread across the valley below, and allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the simple beauty of it. 15 years, and the view never grew old. She was refilling the woodbox when she heard them. The sound was wrong from the first moment. Human voices, yes, but young and frightened, crashing through the brush with none of the caution that these woods demanded. Olynde set down the armload of split pine and picked up her rifle in one smooth motion, moving to the side of the cabin where she had a clear view down the slope. 2 figures emerged from the tree line, stumbling more than walking. Girls, both of them, one perhaps 16 and the other a few years younger. Their clothes marked them as town-bred wool dresses, now torn and mud-stained, good leather shoes completely wrong for mountain travel. The older girl was supporting the younger one, half dragging her up the final approach to the cabin. Olynde stepped into view, rifle lowered but ready. That's far enough. Both girls froze. The older one's hand moved instinctively toward her sister, protective. Up close, Olynde could see they were in bad shape. Scratches covered their hands and faces, their hair hung in tangled mats, and they both shook with either cold or exhaustion or both. They'd been traveling hard and scared. "Please," the older girl said. Her voice carried the kind of desperation that came from being completely out of options. "We need help." Olynde studied them for a long moment, running from something that was clear enough. The question was what, and whether it would follow them here. "You alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Anyone tracking you?" A hesitation, then, "I don't know. Maybe." Olynde considered sending them on their way. Considered it seriously, weighing her isolation against whatever trouble these girls carried with them. But the younger one chose that moment to collapse, her legs simply giving out, and the older sister barely managed to keep her from hitting the ground hard. "Inside," Olynde said, making the decision she'd probably regret. Quickly, she got them through the laned door and into chairs, started water heating while she assessed the damage. Nothing life-threatening that she could see, but they were deeply exhausted, dehydrated, and the younger one was running a fever. She'd seen this condition before, in refugees during the war. People pushed past all reasonable limits by fear. "When did you last eat?" she asked. The older girl had to think about it. "Yesterday morning. Maybe the morning before. I'm not sure." Olynde cut bread and brought out some preserved venison, watched them devour it with the single-minded focus of the truly hungry. She let them eat before asking questions. That was another lesson from the war. A starving person can't think clearly, and fear makes the hunger worse. When they'd slowed down, she poured water from the heating pot into tin cups and set them on the table. "I'm Olynde Marrin. This is my cabin. You're safe for the moment, but I need to know what you're running from." The girls exchanged a glance. The older one spoke. My name is Ilarion. This is my sister, Junith. We've been traveling for 3 days. From where? A place east of here. We were being held there. Held, Olynde repeated. You mean imprisoned? Ilarion nodded. For 3 months. We escaped 2 weeks ago. And you've been running since then? Yes, ma'am. Olynde processed this. 3 months of captivity, 2 weeks on the run, and they'd somehow made it into some of the roughest country in the Montana Territory. Either they were remarkably capable or remarkably lucky, and she suspected it was more the latter than the former. Who was holding you? She asked. Another exchange of glances. Junith spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse. Men who worked for Colonel Voss. The name meant nothing to Olynde, but she filed it away. And why did this colonel want you? To control our father, Ilarion said. She looked directly at Olynde when she spoke next, as if the name should mean something. Bram Reddick. The world tilted slightly. Olynde kept her face neutral through years of practice, but inside, something cold and sharp twisted in her chest. Bram Reddick. These were his daughters. She was looking at the children of the man she'd helped destroy, sitting at her table, asking for her help. Your father, she said carefully. Bram Reddick. Yes, ma'am. Do you know him? Olynde stood, moved to the window, needed the moment to think. Of course they wouldn't know her name meant anything. They'd have been small children when the tribunal happened, and Bram had been exiled. No reason for them to connect Olynde Marrin to their father's past. I knew him, she said finally, a long time ago. Is he alive? Junith asked. They told us he was dead, but we don't believe them. I don't know, Olynde said truthfully. I haven't had contact with him in 15 years. Ilarion's shoulders slumped slightly, hope deferred if not quite extinguished. We thought if we could get away, if we could hide long enough, maybe he'd find us. If he's still alive, he'd be looking. Why come to the mountains? Olynde asked. There are towns, settlements, places with law and protection. Colonel Voss controls the towns, Ilarion said. He has men everywhere. The only place we thought we might be safe was somewhere so remote that no one would think to look. Sound reasoning, as far as it went. But it raised another question. How did you find this cabin? The girls looked at each other again. This time, neither seemed willing to speak first. Olynde waited, letting the silence work for her. Finally, Ilarion reached into her dress and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a torn shawl that had once been fine wool, now stained and damaged. Our mother made this. Before she died, she told us if anything ever happened, if we were ever in danger and couldn't find our father, we should look for a woman named Olynde who lived in the high mountains. The cold thing in Olynde's chest twisted harder. Your mother said that? Yes, ma'am. She said you made a promise to her. Olynde turned away from the window, crossed to the table, took the shawl in her hands. She recognized the stitching, remembered Marianne Reddick's skilled fingers working the needle during long afternoons when they'd talked about everything and nothing. That had been before the tribunal, before everything fell apart. Marianne had been dying even then, though neither of them had spoken the word. Your mother's name was Marianne, Olynde said quietly. Yes, ma'am. And she told you I made her a promise. She said if we ever needed help and couldn't reach our father, we should find you. That you'd keep us safe. Olynde sat down heavily, a promise she didn't remember making, to a woman 15 years dead, now calling in a debt she hadn't known she owed. Except that wasn't quite true. She did remember, vaguely, Marianne asking her to look after the girls if anything happened to Bram. It had seemed like the kind of thing you said when someone was dying, not a real obligation but a comfort to offer. She'd agreed because Marianne had been her friend, and refusing would have been cruel. She'd never imagined it would actually matter. You're in trouble, she said, real trouble, if men have been holding you for 3 months and are still hunting you. Yes, ma'am, And you think your father might still be alive? We hope so. Olynde looked at these two exhausted, frightened girls who'd somehow crossed impossible country to find a woman they'd never met, based on something their dying mother had told them years ago. She thought about promises, about debts, about the weight of words spoken in good faith. She thought about Bram Reddick, wherever he was or wasn't. "How close are the men following you?" she asked. "We don't know," Ilarion admitted. "We lost them maybe 2 days ago, but they're good trackers." Olynde made her decision. She went to the corner where she kept her tack and began gathering items. "You can't stay here. If they're tracking you, and they're any good at all, they'll find this cabin eventually. You need to get to a settlement, somewhere with people and law. But Colonel Voss controls the local towns, I understand, so you go to the territorial capital. That's 2 days' ride if you push it, 3 if you're careful. You tell your story to the territorial marshal. Even if this Voss has local influence, he can't control everything." She pulled out her saddle, the leather cracked but serviceable. "I'm giving you my horse. She's old, but she's steady, and she knows the mountain trails. Follow the creek down until you hit the main valley trail, then head east. Stay on established roads where there are people. Safety, invisibility." "What about you?" Junith asked. Olynde didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about what giving away her horse meant. It was her only reliable way off this mountain. Winter was coming, and without the horse, she'd be trapped here until spring, maybe longer if the snows were bad. It might be a death sentence, depending on how hard the season came. "I'll manage," she said. She helped them gather supplies, food, a water skin, a blanket. She showed Ilarion how to mount, how to handle the reins, the basic commands the horse would respond to. The animal was patient with the inexperienced rider, which was something. As the sun touched the western peaks, Olynde sent them on their way. She watched from her porch as they disappeared down the trail, Ilarion riding and Junith walking alongside. The younger girl had protested leaving on foot, but Olynde had been firm. The horse could carry 1 rider and supplies, or 2 riders, and nothing. The choice was obvious. When they were out of sight, Olynde went back inside her cabin. She sat at her table in the growing dark and thought about the promise she'd apparently made, about Bram Reddick's daughters, about the trouble that was now almost certainly heading toward her. She loaded her rifle and set it by the door. Then she went to the loose floorboard and retrieved the items she'd kept hidden for 15 years. The daguerreotype, the letter, the journal. She spread them on the table and looked at them in the firelight, these remnants of a past she'd tried to bury. If men were coming, she wanted to remember exactly who she'd been before she became the hermit of the high country. She wanted to remember what she was capable of, for better or worse. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the darkness and waited for dawn, for whatever was coming, for the past to finally catch up with 15 years of running. Dawn came slowly, light seeping into the valley like water finding its level. Olynde had been awake for hours, watching from her window as the darkness thinned and the landscape emerged from shadow. She'd made coffee despite her rationing instincts, needing the ritual more than the warmth. The dust cloud appeared as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. She saw it through her spyglass, a plume rising from the valley floor maybe 5 miles distant, too much dust for a small group. She counted the time it took for the cloud to move a recognizable distance, calculated speed and numbers based on long dormant tactical training. 50 riders at minimum, probably more. She swept the glass along the column's length, trying to pick out details. The distance was too great for faces, but she could see the general formation. They rode in organized groups of 10 to 12, maintaining intervals that spoke of military discipline. Not bandits, then, and not a random militia. These men had training. As she watched, the main body halted in a meadow near the creek. Even from this distance, she could see the efficiency with which they established a camp. Picket lines for the horses, supply wagons positioned for access, perimeter guards posted at intervals. They'd done this before, many times. A smaller group separated from the main body. 5 riders heading up the trail toward her cabin. They'd move faster without the wagons, would reach her in perhaps 2 hours if they maintained a steady pace. Olynde lowered the spyglass and allowed herself a moment of pure memory. Border conflicts, 1861. She'd been 42, recruited as a nurse because the unofficial militias couldn't afford to be particular about civilian versus military medical credentials. She'd been trained in a Philadelphia hospital, had skills that translated well to field medicine. They'd needed her, and she'd needed the escape from a life that had grown small and purposeless after her husband's death. Bram Reddick had commanded the unit she'd been assigned to. 3rd Territorial Militia, they'd called themselves, though the name had no official standing. 200 men, most of them settlers who'd lost property to raids or had family killed in the escalating violence along the disputed borders. Bram had been 45, a former army officer who'd resigned his commission over some disagreement with his superiors that he'd never fully explained. She remembered him as charismatic and brilliant in equal measure. He'd had a gift for tactics, for reading terrain and anticipating enemy movement. More importantly, he'd had the ability to inspire men to follow him into situations that should have terrified them. He'd been fearless in a way that had seemed admirable at first, before she'd understood that fearlessness in a commander could be as dangerous as cowardice. They'd served together for 2 years. In that time, she'd seen him lead successful raids, establish supply lines through hostile territory, and negotiate treaties with indigenous groups that the regular army couldn't manage. She'd also seen him make decisions that prioritized military objectives over human cost, seen him order attacks when retreat would have been wiser. He'd seen him push men past their limits because he believed the cause justified any sacrifice. The incident at Crane's Hollow had been the culmination of tendencies she'd watched develop over months. Intelligence had suggested that a settlement 30 miles from their base was being used to harbor enemy combatants. The source was usually reliable, a scout named Peterson who'd proven accurate in the past. Bram had wanted to move immediately, arguing that delay would allow the enemy to disperse. Olynde had counseled caution, suggested sending additional scouts to confirm the intelligence. She'd pointed out that Crane's Hollow had a mixed population, that there were families with children known to live there. Bram had listened to her concerns, had acknowledged them directly, and had then ordered the raid to proceed. He'd been polite about it, even respectful, but his decision had been final. She remembered the night of the raid with the clarity that trauma sometimes brings. They'd surrounded the settlement in darkness, positioned men at all the exit points Bram had called for. Surrender, offering safe passage to anyone who came out unarmed. Shots had been fired from inside one of the buildings. His men had returned fire. Someone had kicked over a lantern or thrown a torch, and the whole situation had turned into chaos lit by burning structures. When it was over, they'd found 12 men with weapons, clear combatants. They'd also found 7 people who weren't armed. 3 of them had been children under the age of 10. Olynde had worked through the night trying to save the wounded, but 2 of the children had been dead before she reached them, and the 3rd died despite everything she tried. The weight of those small bodies, the particular way a child goes limp when life leaves, the sound a mother makes when you tell her there's nothing more you can do, these things had never left her. Bram had been devastated. She'd seen him standing among the bodies with tears on his face. But when the tribunal convened, when they'd asked if he'd do anything differently, he'd said no. The combatants had been real, the threat had been real, and military necessity had required action. She'd been called to testify as the ranking medical officer present. They'd asked her what she'd seen, what she'd recommended, what Bram had decided. She'd told them the truth, every detail, including her warning about the civilians. She'd tried to be fair, had stated clearly that the intelligence had seemed solid, that the combatants were real, that Bram had acted within the normal parameters of command decision-making. The tribunal had stripped him of command anyway. They'd needed someone to blame, needed to show that civilian deaths had consequences, needed to demonstrate that even in an unofficial militia operating in ambiguous legal territory, there were limits to acceptable action. She'd watched them destroy him, her testimony providing the factual foundation for their judgment. After the verdict, he'd looked at her across the room with an expression she'd never been able to fully parse. Not quite betrayal, not quite understanding, something in between. His wife, Marianne, had been ill even then. Consumption, the doctors said, though Olynde had suspected it was more complicated than that. Marianne had always been fragile, and the stress of Bram's exile had accelerated her decline. She died a year later, and the daughters Ilarion would have been maybe 2 years old. Junith, just an infant, had been sent to live with Bram's brother somewhere east, and Olynde had come to the mountain, carrying guilt and righteousness in equal measure, unable to reconcile telling the truth with destroying a man's life. Now, 15 years later, that man was apparently alive and leading 200 armed riders toward her cabin. She went to the floorboard and retrieved the cavalry journal, opened it to a page marked with a small cross. Bram's handwriting documented the Crane's Hollow raid in precise detail: the intelligence, the tactical approach, the execution, the aftermath. He'd written about the civilian deaths with stark honesty, analyzing what had gone wrong and what could have been done differently. The final line read, "7 lives lost because I valued certainty of action over possibility of error. This calculus haunts me." She'd kept the journal because it proved something she'd needed to believe, that Bram hadn't been a monster, just a man making impossible decisions with incomplete information. That truth existed in shades rather than absolutes, that perhaps both of them had been right and wrong simultaneously. She closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place. Then she went outside to wait. The 5 riders appeared at the tree line exactly when she'd calculated they would. They rode in a loose formation, spread wide enough to cover approaches, but tight enough to support each other if needed. Professional positioning. She stood on her porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground, and watched them come. The lead rider sat his horse with a bearing she recognized even at a distance. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle. As they closed the final 100 yards, she could make out details. Grey hair where there'd once been dark brown, lines on his face that hadn't been there 15 years ago, but the same direct gaze that seemed to see through pretense to whatever truth lay beneath. Bram Reddick reined in 20 feet from her porch. The 4 men with him fanned out slightly, hands near weapons but not quite threatening. Bram himself sat motionless, studying her with the same intensity she was using to study him. The silence stretched out, filled with 15 years of absence and accusation and guilt. Finally he spoke. "Hello, Olynde. It's been a long time." His voice carried the same timbre she remembered, though age had roughened it slightly. She met his gaze and kept her own voice level. "Bram, I'm looking for my daughters. I sent them down the mountain yesterday evening, gave them my horse and directions to the territorial capital." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, though he kept it contained. "They came here, to you. They did. Why?" Olynde considered how much to say, how much he knew or had guessed. "They said their mother told them to find me if they were ever in trouble." Bram's jaw tightened. "Marianne?" "Yes." He looked away then, out toward the valley, and she saw him processing this information. When he looked back, there was something raw in his expression that reminded her of the man standing among the dead at Crane's Hollow. "They were taken from me 3 months ago," he said. "Kidnapped by men working for a colonel named Wendell Voss. I've been searching since." The name meant nothing to Olynde, but the situation was becoming clearer. "They told me they'd been held, that they escaped, and ran to the one person their mother told them about." Bram dismounted, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. His men stayed mounted but alert. "May I approach?" Olynde nodded. He crossed the distance between them, and she could see more clearly the changes 15 years had brought. He was 60 now, or near to it. Still strong, still capable, but carrying the weight of age and experience in ways that showed. He stopped at the base of her porch steps. "I need to know everything they told you." Olynde gestured toward the cabin. "Inside, your men can water their horses at the creek." Bram turned and gave quiet orders. The 4 riders dismounted and led their animals toward the water source, leaving Bram and Olynde alone. She held the door open, and he entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He took in the sparse interior with a single sweep of his eyes, the same tactical assessment she remembered from the old days. She poured coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, set 2 cups on the table. They sat across from each other, the worn wood between them like neutral territory. "They arrived yesterday afternoon," Olynde began. "Exhausted, frightened, half-starved. Said they'd been traveling for 3 days after escaping from wherever they were held." "Did they say where?" "No, just that it was east of here, and that men working for Colonel Voss had kept them imprisoned for 3 months. Bram's hands tightened around his cup. "Voss. They mentioned him. I don't know the name." "You wouldn't. He came up through the ranks after the tribunal, after I was exiled." Bram's voice carried an edge of bitterness that he didn't try to hide. "Wendell Voss was a captain during the border conflicts. Ambitious, political, always positioning himself for advancement. He made colonel 5 years ago, built himself a little empire in the Eastern Territories, and he took your daughters because leverage." Bram pulled a folded paper from his jacket, spread it on the table. It was a letter, the handwriting precise and formal. "This arrived 4 months ago. It demanded I sign over certain land rights my family holds in exchange for my daughter's safe return." Olynde scanned the letter. The demands were specific: mineral rights, timber access, water claims across a substantial portion of the eastern Montana territory. "This is considerable property. It's everything my family accumulated over 3 generations. My grandfather secured the original land grant, my father expanded it, and I inherited what was left after the tribunal seized my personal holdings." He paused. "The only reason I still have it is because the property was held in trust for my daughters. Legally, I'm just the administrator until they come of age. So Voss couldn't take it directly. Not legally. But if I signed over administration rights in exchange for their lives, he'd control it effectively until Ilarion turns 21. That gives him 7 years to extract everything of value." Olynde studied the letter more closely, paying attention to the phrasing and structure. Something about it nagged at her, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. "May I see the envelope?" Bram handed it over. She examined the handwriting, the style of the address, the particular way certain letters were formed. Then she went to her hiding place and retrieved the cavalry journal, opened it to a random page, and set them side by side. "These aren't written by the same person," she said, "but they're similar enough that whoever wrote this letter had access to examples of your handwriting. Someone who knew you during the war years." Bram leaned over to look, and she saw the recognition dawn in his eyes. "You're right. The cadence is similar. The phrasing. Someone trying to write the way I would have written." "Someone who served with you," Olynde said quietly. "Voss? Possibly." Bram sat back thinking. "He was in the unit for about 6 months before transferring to regular army, long enough to have seen my reports, my correspondence." Olynde poured more coffee, organizing her thoughts. "Tell me about the kidnapping. How did it happen?" "My daughters were living with my brother, Thomas, on his ranch east of here. I'd been in Mexico for the past 14 years, staying clear of the territories as required by the exile order. But Thomas kept me informed about the girls, sent letters, let me know they were safe and cared for." His voice roughened. "Then 4 months ago, the letters stopped. It took me 3 weeks to get word that the ranch had been attacked, that Ilarion and Junith had been taken. Your brother? Disappeared. Either killed or complicit, I don't know which. The pain in Bram's voice was evident. I crossed back into the territory in violation of my exile, started searching. The ransom letter found me 2 weeks later. And you've been tracking them since? I put out word among old contacts, offered rewards, followed every lead. 2 weeks ago, I got information that the girls had been held at a mining camp in the eastern mountains. By the time I got there with my men, they'd already escaped. We've been following their trail ever since. Olynde processed this timeline. They covered a lot of ground in 2 weeks. These mountains aren't forgiving. They're Reddick blood, Bram said with quiet pride. Stronger than they look. Olynde thought about the 2 exhausted, terrified girls who'd appeared at her door. Strong, yes, but also desperate and running on nothing but fear and determination. They mentioned their mother told them to find me. When did Marianne say that? Bram was quiet for a long moment. Marianne died 14 years ago. I was already in exile, couldn't return for the funeral. Thomas wrote me that she'd been ill for months, that at the end she'd spent time talking to the girls about family, about people who mattered. He looked directly at Olynde. Apparently you were one of those people. The weight of that statement settled between them. Olynde remembered Marianne, in those last months, before the tribunal, already showing signs of the illness that would kill her. They'd spent afternoons together, talking about everything except the growing tension around Bram's command decisions. Had Marianne known, even then, that everything was about to collapse? Had she been planning for a future where her daughters might need protection? I don't remember making an explicit promise, Olynde said carefully. But Marianne did ask me once if I would look after the girls if anything happened to both of you. I said yes, because it seemed like the compassionate thing to say to a dying woman. I never thought that it would matter. Bram's expression was unreadable. That 15 years later, her daughters would actually need you. Yes. He stood, moved to the window, looked out toward the valley where his men waited. Do you know why I'm here, Olynde? Not just looking for my daughters, but here specifically with 200 armed riders? I assumed you were tracking them. That's part of it. But there's more. He turned back to face her. Voss isn't just after land. He's been systematically destroying anyone who might challenge him in the territories. Old militia members, former officers, anyone with property or influence he can seize. He's building something, some kind of private empire, with himself at the center. And you're gathering forces to stop him. I'm gathering the people he's already hurt. The families he's displaced, the men he's ruined, the communities he's bled dry. Bram's voice hardened with purpose. 200 riders now, more joining every week. They're not random militia. They're people who've lost everything and are willing to fight to get it back. Olynde understood the implications. You're starting a war. I'm finishing one that Voss started. Bram returned to the table, sat down heavily. But first, I need my daughters safe. They're the only family I have left, the only thing that matters more than stopping Voss. The wooden cross she'd carved years ago, marked with the names of those who died at Crane's Hollow, sat on a shelf near the window. Bram's gaze found it, and she saw recognition in his eyes. You kept their names, he said quietly. I remember every one of them. So do I. He looked at her directly. The tribunal asked if I'd make the same decision again. I said yes, because the military objective was real and the intelligence seemed sound. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't say without undermining everything I was trying to build, was that I'd have done everything possible to avoid civilian casualties if I'd truly understood the risk. I thought I was being decisive. I was actually being reckless. It was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever heard from him, and it carried the weight of 15 years of reflection. I told the truth at the tribunal, Olynde said. Everything I witnessed, everything I'd advised, everything you decided. I tried to be fair. You were fair. You were... Also, the reason they had enough evidence to exile me. Bram's voice was calm, stating fact rather than accusation. I was angry about that for a long time. Angry at you, angry at the tribunal, angry at the whole situation, but spending 14 years in Mexico gives you time to think. I made decisions that cost lives. You reported what happened. Neither of us was wrong, exactly. But we both paid prices we didn't expect. The honesty of it, the acknowledgement of complexity rather than simple blame, eased something that had been tight in Olynde's chest for 15 years. Your daughters went down the mountain trail yesterday evening, she said. If they maintained a steady pace and didn't run into trouble, they should reach the valley settlement by this afternoon. From there, it's 2 days to the territorial capital. We'll catch them before the settlement, Bram said. My scouts are already moving ahead. And then I get them somewhere truly safe before I deal with Voss. He stood, extended his hand across the table. Thank you for protecting them, for honoring whatever promise Marianne thought you'd made. Olynde took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who'd worked hard for everything he had. I gave them my only horse. I'm trapped here until spring now, maybe longer. Bram's expression shifted, something like respect mixed with understanding. You gave up your escape route for 2 girls you didn't know because their dead mother asked you to. I made a promise, even if I didn't fully remember making it. He nodded slowly. I have supply wagons with my main camp. We'll leave you provisions before we move out, and when this is over, when Voss is dealt with and my daughters are safe, I'll bring you a new horse myself. You have my word. They walked outside together. The 4 riders had finished watering their horses and stood waiting by the porch. Bram gave them quiet instructions, then turned back to Olynde. One more thing, he said. Voss knows about you. About your testimony, about the tribunal, about everything that happened 15 years ago. If he's tracking my daughters and they came here, he'll know about this place eventually. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you might be. Voss has a long memory and he holds grudges. He's the kind of man who sees everyone as either an asset or a threat. Bram mounted his horse in one smooth motion. Watch yourself, Olynde. The isolation that kept you safe all these years might not be enough anymore. The sun was climbing toward noon, and the day that had started with dust, clouds, and armed riders was settling into an uneasy quiet. Olynde went back inside, sat at her table, and looked at the items she'd spread out the night before. The daguerreotype, the letter, the journal. Pieces of a past she'd thought buried, now scattered across her present like seeds that had somehow found soil. She thought about Marianne, about promises made and kept, about 2 girls running through hostile country to find a woman they'd never met based on their mother's dying words. She thought about Bram, changed and hardened by exile, but still fundamentally the man she'd known, still capable of both violence and love. And she thought about Colonel Wendell Voss, whoever he was, and the threat that Bram's warning implied. The mountain had kept her safe for 15 years, but safety, she was beginning to understand, had never been the same thing as peace. The supplies arrived 3 hours later, brought by 2 of Bram's men in a wagon that somehow navigated the rough trail to her cabin. They unloaded sacks of flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and other staples that would see her through the winter and into spring. One of them, a younger man who introduced himself as Kellen, handled the supplies with efficient care. Commander Reddick said to provision you for 6 months minimum, Kellen said, as they stacked the goods inside her cabin. Figured that's how long until the pass is clear enough for regular travel. Olynde watched them work, uncomfortable with the charity but practical enough to accept it. Without her horse, these supplies might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Thank you. Kellen paused, studying her with open curiosity. You're the one who testified against him, aren't you? At the tribunal? I am. And he's provisioning you anyway. Kellen shook his head. Most men would have let you starve after something like that. Most men aren't, Bram Reddick. No, ma'am. They aren't. Kellen finished stacking the last sack and straightened. For what it's worth, a lot of us think you did the right thing. Telling the truth, I mean. Even when it cost. The other man, older and quieter, nodded agreement. They left shortly after, the wagon creaking back down the trail. Olynde stood on her porch and watched them go, thinking about Kellen's words. Doing the right thing, even when it cost. She'd told herself that for 15 years, used it as justification for her isolation. But hearing it from someone else made it feel different, less like righteousness and more like simple fact. She was organizing the new supplies when she noticed the package at the bottom of one of the sacks. Wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, it carried weight that didn't match food staples. She unwrapped it carefully and found a surveyor's map, folded and marked with notations in several different hands. The map showed the eastern Montana territory in detail, with property lines, mineral deposits, water sources, and timber stands all carefully marked. Certain parcels were outlined in red ink, dozens of them scattered across the region. Each red parcel had a name written next to it, and many of those names had been crossed out with black ink. She spread the map on her table and studied it systematically. The pattern became clear quickly. The crossed out names represented families who'd lost their land. She could see Patterson Ranch, foreclosed 1,873, Kowalski Homestead, abandoned 1,874, Morrison Timber Claim, seized 1,875. The dates progressed chronologically, showing a methodical acquisition of property over several years. The parcels that weren't crossed out carried names she didn't recognize, but one stood out. Reddick Holdings, in trust. It was the largest single property on the map, spanning 3 valleys and including significant river frontage, timber access, and mineral rights. Someone had drawn arrows from this parcel to several others, suggesting strategic importance beyond simple size. Her own mountain, she noticed, fell within the boundaries of what was labeled disputed territorial grant, pending adjudication. The notation was small, easy to miss, but it meant her 15 years of isolation had been spent on land that someone, somewhere, was fighting over in courts or offices she'd never seen. There was a note tucked into the folds of the map, written in Bram's distinctive hand. This is what Voss is building. Every red parcel either taken or targeted. Your mountain is marked because mineral surveys show silver deposits in the high country. He'll come for it eventually. B. R. Olynde sat back, processing the implications. Voss wasn't just targeting the Reddick holdings. He was systematically acquiring every piece of valuable property in the territory through whatever means necessary: legal foreclosure, forced sales, outright seizure. The kidnapping of Bram's daughters was just one move in a larger campaign. She studied the map more closely, looking for patterns. The seized properties formed a rough corridor from the eastern settlements toward the mountain ranges where she lived. If someone controlled all these parcels, they'd control access to timber, minerals, and water for hundreds of miles. They'd control the economic future of the entire territory. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't simple greed, this was empire building. She was still studying the map when she heard horses again, different riders this time, coming from a different direction. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, counting 3 men approaching from the eastern trail. They rode with the casual confidence of people who didn't expect resistance. Olynde stepped onto her porch, rifle visible but not quite aimed. The riders reined in at a respectful distance, hands away from weapons. The leader, a man in his 40s with a neat beard and expensive clothes, smiled pleasantly. "Good afternoon," he called. "Would you be Olynde Marrin?" "I would. My name is Cordell. I'm an associate of Colonel Wendell Voss." He gestured to his companions. "We're looking for 2 young women who may have passed through this area. Sisters, 16 and 14 years old. Have you seen them? Olynde kept her expression neutral. People don't pass through here much. It's remote country. Indeed it is. Cordell's smile never wavered. Which is why we're checking even the unlikely places. The girls are valuable to Colonel Voss. He's quite concerned about their well-being. I'm sure he is. They may have mentioned their father, Bram Reddick. Perhaps tried to reach out to old family friends or associates. Cordell's eyes were sharp, despite the pleasant tone. Colonel Voss is aware of your history with Reddick. Thought you might have been contacted. Haven't seen Bram Reddick in 15 years, Olynde said truthfully. Haven't seen his daughters ever. Cordell studied her for a long moment, as if weighing truth against possibility. Of course. Still, if you do happen to see the girls, Colonel Voss would be most grateful for information. There's a substantial reward for their safe return. How substantial? $500. Each. Cordell let that sink in. That's serious money for someone living alone in the mountains. Could make life considerably more comfortable. $1,000 total. More money than Olynde had seen in 20 years. Enough to provision herself for a decade. Enough to buy horses and equipment and anything else she might need. The temptation was real, and Cordell knew it. I'll keep that in mind, she said carefully. You do that. Cordell gathered his reins. We'll be searching the area for the next few days. If you remember anything, or if circumstances change, you can find us at the mining camp about 15 miles east of here. Just ask for Cordell, and they'll point you our direction. They rode off, taking a different trail than the one Bram's men had used. Olynde watched them until they disappeared into the trees, then went back inside and locked her door. She set the rifle within easy reach and returned to studying the map. The mining camp Cordell mentioned was marked on the map, one of the red parcels with a notation, Silver Creek Mine, Voss Operation Est. 1874. That's where the girls had been held, she realized. That's where they'd escaped from. She traced the route from the mine to her cabin with her finger. It was rough country, probably 40 miles through difficult terrain. The girls had covered that distance in 2 weeks while being pursued, which suggested either remarkable luck or remarkable determination. The afternoon wore into evening. Olynde made a simple dinner from her new supplies, checking the approaches periodically, but seeing no further visitors. As darkness fell, she sat by the fire and thought about the choices in front of her. She could remain neutral, as she'd tried to be for 15 years. Could tell herself this wasn't her fight, that the conflicts between Voss and Bram and everyone else caught between them had nothing to do with her isolated existence. Could pretend the map didn't show her mountain marked as disputed territory, or that Cordell's visit had been just a routine inquiry. Or she could acknowledge what she'd known since the moment Ilarion and Junith appeared at her door. Neutrality was no longer possible. By helping the girls, by honoring whatever promise Marianne thought she'd made, she'd already chosen a side. The question was what to do about it. She pulled the cavalry journal from its hiding place and opened it to the section documenting the Crane's Hollow raid. Bram's handwriting filled the pages with tactical details, but between the lines she could read the moral struggle. He'd been trying to justify the unjustifiable, to find military logic that would excuse civilian deaths. She'd judged him harshly for that at the tribunal. Had presented the facts in a way that emphasized his recklessness, his prioritization of objectives over lives. She'd told the truth, but she'd told it in a way designed to condemn. 15 years had given her perspective she'd lacked then. Bram had been making impossible choices with incomplete information, trying to protect his men and accomplish military objectives in a conflict with no clear rules. She'd been demanding moral certainty in a situation that offered none. They'd both been right. They'd both been wrong. And the children had died anyway. Now here was Voss, systematically destroying lives and livelihoods across the entire territory, building power through methods that made Bram's worst decisions look restrained by comparison. And here was Bram again, gathering forces to oppose him, walking the same line between justice and vengeance that had destroyed him 15 years ago. Olynde closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place. Then she went to the shelf where she kept her medical supplies, items she'd maintained out of habit more than expectation of need. Bandages, surgical tools, medicines preserved in alcohol, skills she'd tried to leave behind but had never quite forgotten. She packed everything carefully into a canvas bag, along with spare clothes and what food she could carry. She checked her rifle, counted her ammunition, made sure her boots were solid. When she finished, she sat at her table and wrote a short note on a scrap of paper. "Gone to help settle old debts. If I don't return by spring, the cabin and supplies belong to whoever finds this. O.M." She left the note on the table, weighted down with a stone. Then she checked the trail one more time, confirmed no one was approaching, and set out walking. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by. She knew these mountains better than anyone alive, knew the game trails and shortcuts and hidden passes that didn't appear on any map. Without a horse, she couldn't match the speed of Bram's riders or Voss's men, but she could move quietly, and she could reach places they couldn't. She'd given the girls directions to the valley settlement. That's where Bram would intercept them and where Voss's men would likely concentrate their search. But there was another route, a high pass that connected to the valley trail about 10 miles from the settlement. If she pushed hard, she could reach it by dawn. Why she was going, what she intended to do when she got there, she couldn't have fully articulated. But Marianne's daughters were out there somewhere, and Bram was riding into a situation that could explode into violence, and Voss's men were searching with methods that wouldn't be gentle if they found what they were looking for. 15 years ago, she'd chosen truth over loyalty, testimony over silence. She'd spent every year since questioning whether that choice had been right. Maybe it was time to make a different kind of choice. The high pass was every bit as difficult as Olynde remembered. She'd used it twice in her early years on the mountain, both times in summer when the route was clear and the weather stable. In late October, with frost making the rocks treacherous and the thin air burning her lungs, it tested every bit of strength and skill she possessed. She reached the summit as the eastern sky began to lighten. From this vantage point, she could see the valley spread below, the settlement just visible as a cluster of buildings near where the mountain creek joined the main river. Smoke rose from chimneys, suggesting people were awake and starting their day. She could also see riders, 2 groups, approaching the settlement from different directions. The first group was smaller, maybe 8 or 10 horses, moving slowly along the main trail from the west. Even at this distance, she recognized the formation as Bram's men, organized, disciplined, maintaining proper intervals. They'd be the advance party, scouting ahead of the main force. The second group approached from the east, at least 20 riders moving with purpose. They rode harder than Bram's men, pushing their horses in a way that suggested urgency. Voss's people, almost certainly, converging on the settlement based on whatever intelligence they'd gathered. Both groups would arrive around the same time, probably within the hour. And, somewhere in or near that settlement, were 2 exhausted girls who'd been running for weeks, thinking they'd finally reached safety. Olynde began her descent. This side of the pass was steeper, requiring careful attention to foot placement and handholds. She moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that speed mattered, but a broken ankle would help no one. Halfway down, she spotted something that made her pause. A thin trail of smoke rising from a copse of trees about 2 miles from the settlement, off the main trail in a direction that suggested someone deliberately avoiding the town. Too small for a camp of any size. Maybe 2 or 3 people at most. She altered her course, angling toward the smoke. The detour would cost her time, but instinct said it mattered. That same instinct had kept her alive through 2 years of border conflicts and 15 years in the wilderness, and she'd learned to trust it. The camp, when she reached it, was exactly what she'd hoped and feared. 2 bedrolls near a small fire, a horse tethered to a tree, and Ilarion sitting watch while Junith slept wrapped in the blanket Olynde had given them. Ilarion saw her approach and grabbed the old rifle, pointing it with shaking hands. "Stop there!" "It's me," Olynde said quietly, stepping into the firelight with her hands visible. "Olynde Marrin, from the cabin." Recognition flooded Ilarion's face, followed by confusion. "How did you... You said you didn't have a horse." "I walked. There's a pass about 5 miles north that cuts through the high country." Olynde moved closer, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. "Why aren't you in the settlement? You should have reached it yesterday." Ilarion lowered the rifle, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "We were going to, but when we got close, we saw armed men asking questions, showing descriptions of us. We didn't know if they were our father's people or Colonel Voss's, so we hid." Smart decision, actually. Cautious and careful in a way that suggested these girls had learned hard lessons during their captivity. "Your father is looking for you. He has men searching the whole area." "Our father is alive." Junith sat up suddenly, sleep vanishing from her face. "You're sure? I met with him yesterday at my cabin, a few hours after you left. He's been tracking you since you escaped." Olynde knelt by the fire, warming her hands. "But Voss's men are also searching, and both groups are converging on the settlement right now. You're caught between them." Ilarion and Junith exchanged glances. The older sister spoke. "How do we know which group to approach? If we guess wrong..." "You don't approach either group," Olynde interrupted. "You stay hidden while I make contact with your father and verify the situation. If it's safe, I'll bring him here. If it's not, we find another way." "Why are you helping us?" Junith asked. Her directness reminded Olynde of Marianne, that same unflinching honesty. "You gave us your horse, and now you walked through the mountains to find us. Our mother must have been very important to you." "She was," Olynde said simply. "And I made her a promise, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. I keep my promises." Movement in the trees behind them. All 3 women turned. Ilarion raising the rifle again, Olynde reaching for her own weapon. But the figure that emerged was Kellen, the young man who'd brought supplies to her cabin. He had his hands up, showing he meant no threat. "Commander Reddick sent me to scout this sector. I saw your fire, and..." He stopped as he recognized the girls. "Ilarion? Junith?" "You know him?" Olynde asked. Ilarion nodded slowly. "Kellen served with our Uncle Thomas." "We know him." Kellen approached the fire, his relief evident. "Your father has half the territory looking for you. When you weren't in the settlement, he worried Voss's men had grabbed you first." He looked at Olynde. "You found them? They were smart enough to hide when they saw armed men in town. But we have a problem. Voss's riders are also converging on the settlement." "I know. We've been tracking them." Kellen's expression hardened. "There's at least 20 of them, well armed. Commander Reddick is bringing up the main force, but they're still a few hours out. If Voss's men find the girls before we can secure them..." A distant sound interrupted him. Gunfire, coming from the direction of the settlement. Single shots at first, then a sustained volley. Everyone in the camp went still, listening. "That started sooner than expected," Kellen said grimly. He looked at Olynde. "Can you keep them safe here while I report to the commander? How far out is Bram?" 2 miles, maybe less. He's moving the main column up carefully, trying not to spook the settlement or provoke Voss's men prematurely. More gunfire, closer now, voices shouting, though the words were indistinct. The situation in the settlement was deteriorating rapidly. Olynde made a decision. "Take the girls to your commander. I'll scout the settlement, see what's happening." "That's dangerous," Kellen protested. "If Voss's men recognize you, they don't know what I look like. Cordell visited my cabin yesterday, but we met at distance, and he's never seen me up close." She was already checking her rifle, making sure it was loaded. "I'm just another settler as far as anyone knows. I can move through town, gather intelligence, find out what triggered the shooting. Ilarion stepped forward. Take us with you. We can help. No. Olynde's voice was firm. Your job is to stay alive and reach your father. Kellen will get you there safely. She's right, Kellen said. The commander's priority is securing you two. Everything else is secondary. The gunfire had stopped, leaving an ominous silence. Olynde didn't wait for further discussion. She set out toward the settlement at a steady jog, using the terrain for cover, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of approach many times before. The settlement was small, maybe 20 buildings clustered around a main street, with a general store, a blacksmith, and what looked like a boarding house. As Olynde approached from the tree line, she could see bodies in the street. 3 men down, not moving, several horses running loose, frightened by the shooting. People were sheltering in buildings, faces visible in windows. A woman was crying, the sound carrying in the morning air. The armed riders, Voss's men, she assumed had taken positions around the perimeter of town, controlling access points. Olynde circled wide, using the scatter of outbuildings for cover, until she found a position where she could observe without being easily seen. From here, she could make out details. The 3 bodies in the street wore the kind of rough clothing common to frontier militia. Bram's men, she realized with a cold certainty. They'd ridden into town and been ambushed, probably killed before they could even identify themselves properly. Cordell stood in the middle of the street, directing his men with calm efficiency. He was talking to someone, the settlement's mayor or sheriff, probably demanding information. Even from a distance, his body language communicated threat. "Don't care about your neutrality," Cordell was saying, his voice carrying. 2 girls came through here, or were headed here. Young, traveling alone or with minimal escort. Someone saw them, someone knows where they went. The man he was addressing, an older settler with grey hair, shook his head. "We haven't seen any young girls. You've already searched every building. You know we're telling the truth." Cordell backhanded him casually, the kind of violence that came from practice. The older man went down hard. "Then maybe you need encouragement to remember better." Olynde felt the familiar coldness settle over her, the same detachment she'd learned during the war years when violence became necessary. She counted Voss's men methodically, 22 total, positioned at key points around the settlement. They had the tactical high ground and superior numbers if it was just the 8 or 10 of Bram's advance party. But Bram was bringing 200 men, and they'd be here within hours. Cordell probably knew that, which meant he was working against a deadline. The casual brutality, the willingness to kill Bram's scouts without hesitation, these were the actions of someone who understood his window of opportunity was closing. A rider approached from the east, moving fast. He reined in next to Cordell and spoke urgently, though Olynde couldn't make out the words. Cordell's posture changed, becoming more alert. He gave quick orders, and half his men mounted up. They were leaving, heading east, following some new intelligence about the girl's location probably, which meant Kellen needed to get Ilarion and Junith to Bram immediately, before Voss's men expanded their search pattern. Olynde began, working her way back toward the tree line, intending to intercept Kellen and warn him. She'd made it about halfway when a voice called out behind her, "You there, woman in the trees." She turned slowly. One of Voss's men had spotted her, was pointing a rifle in her general direction. Not Cordell, one of the younger riders, maybe 25, with the nervous alertness of someone not quite certain of his authority. "Me? Me." Olynde called back, keeping her voice uncertain, frightened. "I'm just trying to get home. I heard shooting and come out, where I can see you properly." She emerged from the trees, hands visible, rifle slung over her shoulder in a way that suggested she carried it for protection rather than combat. The young rider studied her as she approached, his suspicion evident. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Sarah," Olynde lied. "Sarah Brennan." I have a homestead about 3 miles north, came into town for supplies and got caught when the shooting started. You see 2 young girls anywhere? Sisters, traveling together? No, sir. I've been hiding since the first shots. Didn't see anyone, except your men and those poor fellows in the street. He seemed to accept this, though he kept his rifle ready. Get on home, then. And if you do see those girls, there's reward money for information. $500 each. I'll remember that, Olynde said. She started to leave, then paused as if a thought had just occurred to her. Those men you're looking for, the ones you shot, did they do something wrong? They were protecting property that doesn't belong to them, the young rider said. Working for a criminal named Reddick, who's been causing trouble throughout the territory. I see. Well, I hope you find what you're looking for. She walked away, keeping her pace steady and unhurried, aware of his eyes on her back until she reached the tree line. Once out of sight, she broke into a run. She had to reach Kellen before Voss's men expanded their search. Had to warn Bram about the ambush in the settlement. Had to make sure Alarian and Junith stayed hidden and safe. The war she'd thought she'd left behind 15 years ago had found her anyway, and this time she wasn't going to stand aside and watch from a position of moral certainty. This time she was going to choose a side and live with the consequences. Olynde found Kellen and the girls 2 miles north of the settlement, moving through heavy timber that provided cover but slowed their progress. Kellen had his rifle out, scanning constantly for threats, while Alarian and Junith stayed close behind him. Voss's men ambushed 3 of Bram's scouts in the settlement. Olynde reported as she caught up. Killed them before they could identify themselves. Cordell is running the operation, and he's working against a timeline. He knows Bram is coming with force. Kellen's face hardened. Which 3? I couldn't tell from distance. But they're dead, and Cordell is using it to intimidate the townspeople into providing information. Did it work? No. But half his men just rode east, following some new lead. If they're expanding their search pattern, we need to get the girls to safety immediately. They kept moving. Kellen, setting a pace that was just short of running. The forest was thick here, old-growth pine and spruce that blocked most of the sunlight and created a perpetual twilight, even at midday. Good for concealment, but it also limited their ability to see threats approaching. After 30 minutes of hard travel, they broke into a clearing where Bram waited with perhaps 50 riders. He was standing next to his horse, conferring with 2 older men who had the bearing of experienced commanders. When he saw his daughters, everything else ceased to matter. Alarian, Junith. His voice broke on their names. The girls ran to him. Olynde watched the reunion from a respectful distance, saw 15 years of separation and 3 months of terror dissolve in the simple act of a father embracing his children. Bram was crying openly, his face buried in Alarian's hair, while Junith clung to his side. The hardened militia commander had vanished, leaving just a man who'd thought he might never see his daughters again. The moment stretched, private, despite the 50 witnesses. Then Bram pulled himself together, wiped his eyes, and held both girls at arm's length to study them. Are you hurt? Did they? We're all right, Alarian said. Tired and scared, but they didn't hurt us. Not really. They kept us locked up, Junith added. Fed us enough to stay healthy, but they wouldn't tell us anything except that you had to sign papers to get us back. Bram's expression went cold. I would have signed anything, everything. I was ready to give Voss every piece of property, every right, every claim our family held. But he kept changing the terms, kept adding demands. I finally realized he never intended to return you. He just wanted to break me first. He looked over his daughters' heads to where Olynde stood. You found them. They were smart enough to hide when they saw armed men in the settlement. I just made contact and brought them here. 3 of my men are dead in that settlement, one of the older commanders said. His name was Garrett, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in hard country. Cordell won't let that stand. We need to assume he's coming for us in force. Then we position for defense and wait for the main column, Bram said. He was back to being a commander, the emotional moment compartmentalized. How far out are they? 2 hours. Maybe less, Garrett replied. But that gives Cordell time to set an ambush if he guesses our route. Olynde stepped forward. There's something else you need to know. Cordell visited my cabin yesterday before I left. He was asking about the girls, offering reward money for information. He knows about my connection to you, Bram. He knows about the tribunal. So Voss has been planning this for a while, Bram said, using my past, my associations, to predict where the girls might run. He looked at Olynde directly. What did you tell him? That I hadn't seen you in 15 years and didn't know your daughters, but he'll check, and when he finds the girls came to my cabin, he'll know I lied. That makes me a target too. Ilarion spoke up. There's something we need to tell you, about Uncle Thomas. Bram's expression went very still. What about him? He's the one who arranged our kidnapping, Ilarion said quietly. We heard him talking to Cordell the night before we were taken. He sold us to Voss in exchange for money and a piece of the land rights. The silence that followed was absolute. Bram stood frozen, processing this information. His own brother, the man he'd trusted to raise his daughters while he was in exile. The betrayal was so complete, so fundamental, that for a moment he seemed unable to form words. Thomas, he finally said. My brother Thomas. We're sorry, Junith whispered. We know you trusted him. Bram pulled both girls close again, as if physical contact could protect them from the truth they'd just revealed. You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. His voice was rough with emotion. Thomas made his choice. He'll answer for it. Olynde watched this unfold with growing understanding. The kidnapping hadn't been a random crime of opportunity. It had been carefully planned by someone with intimate knowledge of the family. Someone who knew exactly how to hurt Bram most effectively. Someone motivated by greed and perhaps resentment for the brother who'd been exiled while he'd remained to manage the family holdings. Where is Thomas now? She asked. We don't know, Ilarion said. He wasn't at the mining camp where they kept us. We only saw Cordell and his men. Garrett spoke up. If Thomas was working with Voss, he might be back east with the main operation. Or he might have taken his payment and disappeared. He's not the disappearing type, Bram said coldly. He'll be somewhere close, making sure his investment pays off. And when I find him... He stopped, aware of his daughters listening. We'll deal with that when the time comes. Kellen had been standing watch at the clearing's edge. He called back now, urgency in his voice. Riders approaching from the south. At least a dozen, moving fast. Everyone moved immediately into defensive positions. The girls were placed in the center with several guards, while Bram's men spread out among the trees, using the terrain for cover. Olynde found herself next to Bram, behind a fallen log that provided good protection and clear sightlines to the approaching trail. Can you still shoot? Bram asked quietly. I imagine I remember how. Good. Because if this is Cordell, he'll have instructions to kill everyone and recover the girls. Voss doesn't care about witnesses anymore. The riders emerged into view. Not Cordell's men these wore, different colors, and rode in a tighter formation. The leader was a woman in her 50s, riding a grey mare with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. She reined in at the clearing's edge, taking in the defensive positions with an experienced eye. Hold your fire, she called. I'm looking for Bram Reddick, and I come with information he needs. Bram stood, rifle ready but not aimed. I'm Reddick. Who are you? My name is Constance Vale. I manage the telegraph office in Millerton, about 20 miles east of here. She dismounted, moving slowly to show she meant no threat. I've been monitoring wire traffic related to Colonel Voss's operations. 3 days ago, I intercepted a message that I thought you should know about. She pulled a paper from her saddlebag, unfolded it, and read aloud. Girls located vicinity of Marrin cabin, high country. Recommend immediate recovery before Reddick contact. Authorization to eliminate all witnesses, including Marrin. Will require minimum 20 men. Advise on tribunal testimony leverage. Cordell. The words hung in the air like smoke. Olynde felt something cold settle in her stomach. Authorization to eliminate all witnesses, including Marrin. They'd been planning to kill her from the moment they knew the girls had reached her cabin. There's more, Constance continued. The response came from someone signing as W.V., Wendell Voss, presumably. It read, Marrin testimony destroyed Reddick 15 years ago. Use it again. Suggest she testify Reddick kidnapped own daughters, orchestrated entire situation. If she refuses, eliminate and fabricate evidence. Priority is securing property transfer. W.V. Bram looked at Olynde, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Voss planned the tribunal. 15 years ago, he manufactured the situation that got me exiled. That's my assessment, Constance said. I've been tracking his operations for 2 years, ever since he forced my family off our land using falsified foreclosure documents. The pattern is always the same. Create a crisis, manipulate the legal system, seize property while everyone is distracted by the human drama. Olynde's mind was racing, recontextualizing everything she thought she knew. The raid at Crane's Hollow, the intelligence about enemy combatants, came from one of Voss's scouts, Constance confirmed. I found the original reports in the territorial archives. The intelligence was deliberately inflated to make military action seem necessary. And the civilians who died, 3 of them, were children from families that owned valuable timber rights. After their deaths, those rights went into probate and were eventually acquired by intermediaries working for Voss. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Voss had engineered the entire situation, the false intelligence, the civilian casualties, the tribunal that destroyed Bram's career. He'd used Olynde's honest testimony to accomplish his goal, weaponizing her integrity, against both her and Bram. The children still died, Olynde said quietly. That part was real. The children died because Voss put them in harm's way deliberately, Constance countered. He fed false intelligence, knowing it would lead to civilian casualties, knowing those casualties would justify a tribunal, knowing the tribunal would destroy the one commander with enough influence to oppose his land acquisition schemes. Bram sat down heavily on the log. 15 years. He's been building this empire for 15 years, and it started with Crane's Hollow. It started before that, Constance said. But Crane's Hollow was his first major operation. After that, he refined his methods. Legal foreclosures, property seizures, kidnappings when necessary, always with just enough legal cover to avoid direct prosecution. Ilarion had been listening from her protected position. Now she spoke up. At the mining camp, we heard Cordell talking to another man about the end game. They said once they had father's signature on the property transfers. They'd control enough territory to apply for provisional statehood. Voss wants to be territorial governor. Then senator, Junith added. They talked about that too. How controlling the land meant controlling the political future. Constance nodded. That's consistent with everything I've uncovered. Voss isn't just greedy, he's ambitious. He wants legitimate power, and he's willing to destroy anyone who stands in his way. Olynde felt the weight of this revelation pressing down on her. 15 years she'd carried guilt over the tribunal, over the testimony that had destroyed Bram's career. 15 years of isolation, driven by the belief that she'd chosen truth over loyalty and had to live with the consequences. Now she understood that her truth had been built on lies. That Voss had manipulated her as surely as he'd manipulated everyone else. That the children who died at Crane's Hollow had been sacrificed not in the confusion of war, but as deliberate pawns in a long-term political scheme. She looked at Bram. I'm sorry. I testified in good faith, but I should have questioned the intelligence more carefully. Should have pushed harder to verify. No. Bram's voice was firm. You did exactly what you should have done. You reported what you witnessed. You told the truth as you understood it. The fact that Voss built his scheme on that truth doesn't make you responsible for his actions. But the children died because I ordered a raid based on intelligence I should have verified. More thoroughly, Bram interrupted. And the intelligence was false because Voss manufactured it. We were both used, Olynde, both manipulated. The guilt belongs to him, not us. Constance cleared her throat. I hate to interrupt, but Cordell will have received updates by now. He knows the girls aren't at Marrin's cabin, knows they've likely made contact with your forces. He'll be regrouping for a major assault. Then, we need to move the girls to safety and prepare for a confrontation, Bram said. He stood, back in command mode. Constance, how many riders did you bring? 12. All people who've lost property to Voss, all willing to fight. Good. We can use every gun. Bram looked around the clearing, assessing positions. Garrett, take 20 men and escort my daughters back to the main column. The rest of us will establish a defensive position here and wait for Cordell. When he comes, we end this. Olynde stood as well. There's something else you need to know. When Cordell visited my cabin, I noticed something about his speech patterns. He uses very formal phrasing, almost archaic, like someone who spent time studying old military correspondence. Bram's eyes sharpened. Show me the ransom letter again. Garrett produced it from his pack. Bram and Olynde studied it together, and she saw him recognize what she'd noticed. The phrasing is similar to my old reports, but there are small differences. Someone imitating my style but not quite getting it right. Cordell wrote this, Olynde said, not Voss. Which means Cordell has been part of this operation from the beginning. He was probably the one who provided the false intelligence about Crane's Hollow. Constance nodded. Cordell served as a scout in the border conflicts. He would have had access to intelligence reports, would have known how to make false information seem credible. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of conspiracy that stretched back 15 years and touched everyone in this clearing. Voss had orchestrated everything, but Cordell had been his instrument, his tactical operator in the field. When we confront them, Bram said quietly, I want Cordell alive. I want him to testify about Crane's Hollow, about the false intelligence, about all of it. I want the official record corrected. And Voss? Garrett asked. Bram's expression went cold. Voss answers for kidnapping my daughters, for destroying families across this territory, for the children who died at Crane's Hollow because he needed civilian casualties to justify a tribunal. He looked at each person in the clearing. This ends today. One way or another, we finish what Voss started 15 years ago. Ilarion and Junith were mounted on horses, ready to leave with their escort. But before they departed, Ilarion reached into her dress and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Olynde. This belonged to our mother. She wanted you to have it. Olynde unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with age. She opened it and found 2 small portraits, one of Ilarion and Junith as small children, the other of herself and Marianne, taken during those afternoons of conversation before the tribunal. She'd forgotten that photograph existed. Looking at it now, she saw 2 women who'd been friends, who'd trusted each other, who'd shared confidences and dreams. Marianne had been dying even then, and Olynde had known it. And they'd both pretended everything was normal because that was easier than confronting the inevitable. She told us if we ever found you, we should give you this, Ilarion said. She said you'd understand what it meant. Olynde understood. It meant the promise had been real, not just words of comfort to a dying woman. It meant Marianne had trusted her with the most precious thing in her life, her daughter's safety. It meant that despite everything that had happened, despite the tribunal and the exile and 15 years of separation, Marianne had believed in her. Thank you, Olynde said quietly. I'll keep it safe." She watched the girls ride off with their escort, watched Bram's face as he forced himself to let them go for their own safety. Then she turned her attention to the preparations for what was coming. Cordell would arrive within hours, and when he did, 15 years of lies would finally be confronted with 15 years, twos of truth. The defensive position Bram established was tactical perfection. The clearing provided open fields of fire, while the surrounding timber offered cover and concealment. He positioned his men in overlapping sectors, ensuring that anyone approaching would be caught in crossfire from multiple angles. Olynde found herself assigned to the northern approach with Kellen and 3 others, their rifles covering the main trail from the settlement. "You've done this before," Kellen observed as she checked sightlines and fallback positions. "Long time ago, but some things you don't forget." Constance Vale was positioned at the clearing center with Bram, her role more strategic than tactical. She'd brought maps and documents, evidence of Voss's operations that would be needed for any eventual legal confrontation. But first they had to survive the immediate threat. Bram moved among his men with calm efficiency, checking positions, offering encouragement, making small adjustments to fields of fire. Watching him, Olynde saw the commander he'd been 15 years ago, competent, thoughtful, earning his men's trust through demonstrated skill rather than mere authority. "You're thinking about Crane's Hollow," Bram said, appearing beside her position. "Am I that obvious?" "I'm thinking about it too. About how different things might have been if I'd been more cautious, if I'd questioned the intelligence more thoroughly." He settled into cover next to her. "But dwelling on might-have-beens doesn't help anyone. Constance's information changes everything," Olynde said. "We were both manipulated." "The guilt I've been carrying was based on real events," Bram interrupted. "Children did die. You testified truthfully about what you witnessed. The fact that Voss orchestrated the situation doesn't erase what happened, it just changes who's ultimately responsible." "Does that help, knowing we were pawns in someone else's scheme?" Bram was quiet for a moment. "It helps me understand why things happened the way they did. It doesn't erase 15 years of exile or the time I lost with my daughters. But it gives me something to fight for beyond simple revenge." "What's that?" "Justice. Real justice. Not the kind that Voss manipulated at the tribunal." He looked at her directly. "You told the truth 15 years ago. Today, we make sure that truth is heard in proper context. That the children who died at Crane's Hollow are remembered as victims of Voss's manipulation, not casualties of my recklessness." Movement on the northern trail. Everyone tensed, rifles coming up, but it was just one of their own scouts returning at a run. He made his way to Bram's position and delivered his report. "Cordell's coming with at least 40 men, maybe more. They're moving in 2 columns, trying to flank the clearing from east and west simultaneously." "How far out?" 30 minutes, maybe less." Bram processed this. That's more men than he had at the settlement. He must have called in reinforcements from the mining camp. "Probably figured he needed overwhelming force," Garrett said. "He'd remain behind when the girls' escort left, taking command of the eastern approach. Question is whether he knows our actual strength." "He knows we have numbers," Bram said. "But he might not know we have position and preparation." He raised his voice slightly so everyone could hear. "Cordell's coming with 40 men or more. Our orders are to defend this position and take prisoners if possible. Anyone who surrenders will be disarmed, but not harmed. We're not here for massacre, we're here to stop Voss's operation and bring him to justice." The men acknowledged these orders with nods and quiet confirmations. Olynde appreciated the discipline. These weren't random militia or bandits looking for a fight. They were settlers and farmers who'd lost property to Voss's schemes, who'd been forced from their homes, who had genuine grievances and genuine stakes in the outcome. Constance appeared at Olynde's position, carrying a leather satchel. "I wanted you to see these before the fighting starts. They're relevant to your testimony." She pulled out documents, spreading them carefully on the ground. official correspondence, intelligence reports, tribunal transcripts. One document in particular caught Olynde's attention, a letter from Cordell to Voss, dated 2 weeks before the Cranes Hollow raid. The settlement at Cranes Hollow presents an opportunity. The letter read, "The Sullivan children's family holds timber rights we need. If civilian casualties occurred during a legitimate military operation, those rights would go into probate and become available for acquisition. Peterson can be convinced to provide intelligence suggesting enemy combatants in the settlement. Commander Reddick has shown consistent willingness to act on Peterson's information. I recommend we proceed." The casual planning of children's deaths, discussed in the same tone, someone might use to plan a business transaction, made Olynde's stomach turn. "The Sullivan children," she said quietly. "I remember them. Twin girls, maybe 8 years old. They died in the fire. And their families' timber rights were acquired by one of Voss's shell companies 6 months later," Constance confirmed, "for a fraction of their actual value during the probate confusion." Olynde stared at the letter, at the cold calculation it represented. This proves premeditation. This proves Voss and Cordell deliberately engineered civilian casualties. It does, which is why we need to survive today and get this evidence to territorial authorities who aren't under Voss's influence. Constance gathered the documents back into her satchel. "I've made copies and hidden them in 3 separate locations. Even if something happens to these, the truth will eventually come out. More movement, this time from multiple directions. The scouts had been right about Cordell's approach too. Columns, one from the east and one from the west, trying to catch the clearing in a pincer movement." Bram's voice rang out clear and calm. "Hold positions. Wait for my signal. Remember, we want prisoners if possible." The eastern column appeared first, riders moving cautiously through the timber. They were being careful, suggesting they suspected an ambush, but weren't certain of the details. Olynde counted 23 men, all armed with rifles and revolvers, all wearing the kind of mismatched gear that suggested hired guns rather than organized military. The western column emerged shortly after with similar numbers. Cordell rode at the front of this group, his neat appearance and composed bearing distinctive even at a distance. He reined in at the clearing's edge, studying the defensive positions. His men spread out in a loose line behind him, maintaining discipline despite the obvious danger. Whatever else Cordell might be, he was a competent tactical commander. "Bram Reddick," Cordell called. "I know you're in there. Let's discuss this reasonably." Bram stood, making himself visible but staying in cover. "Where are my daughters?" "Safe, for the moment, but that can change depending on how this conversation goes." "You're lying. My daughters escaped your custody 2 weeks ago and are currently under heavy guard miles from here." Bram's voice carried absolute certainty. "So let's skip the negotiation theater and discuss what's actually happening." Cordell's expression didn't change, but Olynde saw tension in his shoulders. He'd been counting on the daughters as leverage, and learning that advantage was gone had shifted his calculations. "Then let's be direct," Cordell said. "You're wanted for multiple crimes in this territory. Your exile order was violated when you crossed the border. You've assembled an illegal militia and engaged in violence against legitimate business operations. Surrender now, and I can guarantee a fair tribunal. Like the tribunal 15 years ago?" Bram's voice carried an edge. "The one where you and Voss manufactured false intelligence to justify a raid you knew would cause civilian casualties? Where you used honest testimony from people like Olynde Marrin to destroy my career while covering up your own manipulation?" Cordell's composure cracked slightly. His eyes swept the defensive positions, and Olynde knew the moment he spotted her. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by calculation. "Miss Marrin," he called, "you're in distinguished company. Does Reddick know you're the one who destroyed his career? That your testimony sent him into exile?" "He knows," Olynde called back. "He also knows I was telling the truth about what I witnessed. What I didn't know was that you and Voss had orchestrated the entire situation to justify seizing property from the families of the children who died. That's quite an accusation. Do you have proof? We have your letter to Voss, Bram said, the one where you planned the Crane's Hollow raid specifically to cause civilian casualties. We have evidence of the property seizures that followed. We have testimony from the telegraph operator about your communications regarding my daughter's kidnapping. We have everything we need to prove what you and Voss have been doing for 15 years. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Cordell sat his horse, visibly thinking through his options. He was outnumbered and outflanked, but he still had 40 armed men, and the desperate certainty of someone who knew capture meant execution for his crimes. "You're bluffing," Cordell finally said. "You don't have evidence that would stand up in any legitimate court." "Then I suppose we'll find out," Bram replied. "But first, you need to decide whether you want to surrender and face trial, or fight and die here in this clearing. Because those are your only two options." Cordell looked at his men, at the defensive positions surrounding them, at the faced, tactical reality of his situation. Then he looked back at Bram with an expression of cold determination. "I've spent 15 years building Colonel Voss's empire. I'm not going to let it collapse because of some self-righteous militia commander and a woman with a guilty conscience." He raised his voice. "All units, engage targets. No prisoners." The first shots came from Cordell's eastern column, aimed at Garrett's positions. Bram's men returned fire with disciplined precision, and the clearing erupted into chaos. Olynde, sighted on a rider trying to flank their position, squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle's familiar kick. The rider went down, whether wounded or just seeking cover, she couldn't tell. Next to her, Kellen was firing steadily, his shots carefully aimed rather than sprayed randomly. Cordell's men were trying to break through the defensive perimeter, but Bram's positioning had been too good. Every approach was covered by crossfire, every gap was protected by overlapping fields of fire. The attackers were being cut down or forced into cover, their advantage in numbers nullified by superior tactics. Cordell himself had dismounted and was directing his men from behind a fallen tree, his voice carrying commands even over the gunfire. He was good, Olynde had to admit. Despite the tactical disadvantage, he was keeping his force organized and looking for weaknesses in the defense. "He's trying to concentrate force on the southern approach," Kellen called. "If he breaks through there, he can roll up our whole line." Bram had seen it too. He was already moving men to reinforce the south, using the clearing's natural features to shift positions without exposing them to fire. The southern defenders held, barely, and Cordell's assault stalled. The fight lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt longer. Gradually, as casualties mounted and ammunition ran low, Cordell's men began to break. First one, then another threw down weapons and raised hands in surrender. The organized assault fragmented into individual fights, then into scattered resistance, then into silence, broken only by the moans of wounded men. Cordell was still behind his tree, still armed, but surrounded now by Bram's men. He'd been hit. Blood stained his shoulder, but he held his revolver steady as Bram approached. "It's over, Cordell. Put down the weapon. It's not over until Voss says it's over." Cordell's voice was tight with pain, but still defiant. "You think you've won something here? This is just one engagement. Voss has resources you can't imagine, influence that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Then we'll deal with that when it comes." Bram kept his rifle trained but didn't fire. Last chance, surrender or die. Cordell looked around at his defeated men, at the bodies scattered across the clearing, at the blood staining his own shirt. Then he dropped the revolver and raised his hands. "I want guarantees, a fair trial, proper legal representation." "You'll get a trial," Bram said. "Whether it's fair depends on how much truth you're willing to tell about Voss's operations." They secured the prisoners, tended to the wounded on both sides, and began the grim work of counting casualties. 7 of Bram's men were dead, another dozen wounded. Cordell had lost 18, with most of the rest captured or scattered into the wilderness. Olynde worked among the wounded, her old nursing skills returning despite the years. She set bones, extracted bullets, applied pressure to bleeding wounds. The work was familiar and horrifying in equal measure. Each injured man, a reminder of what violence actually cost beyond tactical victories and strategic objectives. Constance was documenting everything with a notebook and pencil, recording names, descriptions of the fight, statements from witnesses. "This all goes to the territorial marshal," she explained. "Along with the documents about Voss's operations, we need a complete record." As sunset approached, Bram's main column arrived, the full 200 riders he'd assembled. They secured the area, established a proper camp, and began preparations for moving the prisoners and wounded to the nearest settlement with medical facilities and a jail. Bram found Olynde as she finished bandaging a young rider's arm. "My daughters?" "Safe with the escort, according to the scouts. They should reach the main camp by morning." He nodded, relief evident. Then he sat down next to her, suddenly looking his full 60 years. "We won today, but Cordell was right about one thing. This isn't over. Voss will respond, and he'll have resources we haven't seen yet. But we have the truth now. We have evidence. We have witnesses. We have Cordell in custody willing to testify to save his own neck. Maybe." Bram looked out across the clearing, at the cost of their victory written in blood and bodies. "Or maybe we just started a war that won't end until one side is completely destroyed." Olynde thought about the letter she'd read, about children's deaths planned like business transactions, about 15 years of manipulation and destruction. "Then we finish it. Properly this time, with truth instead of lies." Bram nodded slowly. "Tomorrow we move on Voss's main operation. The mining camp where my daughters were held, where he's been consolidating his power. We end this, one way or another." In the gathering darkness, with the wounded crying out and the dead waiting for burial, Olynde felt the weight of what was coming. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years, purpose beyond mere survival. She'd spent 15 years hiding from the consequences of telling the truth. Now she was going to fight for the right to tell it again, in a context where it might actually matter. The mining camp sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills, a collection of rough buildings and equipment that spoke to the serious extraction of silver from the mountain rock. Even from the ridge above, Olynde could see the operation's scale. Dozens of workers moving between the shafts and the processing buildings, armed guards posted at regular intervals, supply wagons coming and going on the main road. "That's not just a mining camp," Garrett observed. "That's a fortress." Bram studied the layout through his spyglass. Cordell estimated Voss keeps at least 50 armed men here permanently, plus whatever miners and workers can be pressed into fighting if needed. "We're looking at possibly 75 defenders in fortified positions." "Against our 200, Kellen said. "Numbers favor us, but they have position. And time," Constance added. She'd ridden with the main column despite Bram's suggestion she stay behind with the prisoners. "Voss knows by now that Cordell failed. He'll be preparing for assault." Olynde scanned the camp systematically, using skills she'd learned during the border conflicts. The guards were professional, maintaining good sightlines and overlapping coverage. The buildings were positioned to provide mutual support in case of attack. Someone with military training had designed this layout. "There," she said, pointing to a building set slightly apart from the others. "That structure has better construction than the rest. Looks like it was built to last, rather than just serve temporary mining operations. See the stone foundation and the reinforced walls?" Bram swung his glass to follow her direction. "You're right. That's probably where Voss operates from. Administrative center, storage for valuable records, maybe even living quarters. Which means it's also where he'll make his stand if we breach the outer defenses," Garrett said. They'd been observing for 2 hours, mapping the camp's layout and identifying patterns in the guards' movements. Bram's plan was methodical: contain the camp to prevent reinforcements or escape, neutralize the outer defenses, then force Voss to surrender, or fight in the central building where his options would be limited. We attack at dawn, Bram decided. That gives us tonight to position forces and gives our men time to rest. The prisoners and wounded stay here with a guard detail. Everyone else moves into assault positions by midnight. Olynde listened to the tactical discussion that followed, the careful planning of how to minimize casualties while achieving objectives. Bram had learned caution over the years, she realized. The commander who'd ordered the Crane's Hollow raid without sufficient verification would have simply attacked. This older Bram wanted victory, but not at the cost of unnecessary death. As the officers dispersed to brief their men, Bram gestured for Olynde to walk with him. They moved along the ridge, out of earshot of the others. "You don't have to come tomorrow," he said. "You've already done more than anyone could reasonably ask. You saved my daughters, you fought at the clearing, you've honored whatever promise Marianne thought you made. No one would blame you for staying behind." "I'm coming," Olynde said simply. "Why? This isn't your fight. Voss manipulated both of us, yes, but you were never exiled, never lost 15 years. You could walk away." Olynde thought about how to explain it. "For 15 years, I've been hiding on that mountain, telling myself I was seeking peace when I was really just running from guilt. Guilt over the children who died, guilt over testifying against you, guilt over not doing more to verify the intelligence before the raid." "None of that was your fault," Bram said. "I know that now. But knowing doesn't erase 15 years of believing it was." She looked out over the valley, at the camp where Voss had built his empire on lies and manipulation. "Tomorrow, when we confront Voss, I'm not just fighting for your daughters or for the families he's destroyed. I'm fighting to prove that telling the truth matters, even when people use that truth for evil purposes. I testified honestly 15 years ago. Tomorrow I'm going to make sure that honesty is vindicated." Bram was quiet for a moment. "Marianne would have been proud of you. She always said you had more courage than you gave yourself credit for. Marianne saw the best in everyone. It was one of her most beautiful and dangerous qualities." "She saw clearly in you," Bram countered. "She asked you to protect our daughters because she knew you'd follow through, even 15 years later, even when it cost you everything you'd built." The weight of that statement settled between them. Olynde thought about the locket Ilarion had given her, about the photograph of two friends who'd trusted each other enough to make promises that transcended death and time. "I wish she'd survived to see this," Olynde said. "To see her daughters grown and safe, to see you vindicated, to see the truth finally come out about what Voss did." "She knew," Bram said quietly. "At the end, when she was dying, she told me that the truth always surfaces eventually, that lies might win in the moment, but truth wins across time. I didn't believe her then. I was too angry about the tribunal, too bitter about the exile. But she was right." They returned to the main camp as darkness fell. 200 men prepared for battle with the quiet efficiency of people who understood what was coming. Weapons were cleaned and checked. Ammunition was distributed. Final meals were eaten with the unspoken awareness that some of them wouldn't survive the next day. Olynde found herself sitting by a fire with Kellen and several others from the northern approach defense. They were younger men, mostly, settlers who'd lost family land to Voss's schemes and joined Bram's force looking for justice. "You really testified against the commander?" one of them asked. His name was Daniel, maybe 25, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard all his life. "I did. I reported what I witnessed during a raid that went wrong. Children died, and I told the tribunal exactly how it happened. And now you're fighting alongside him," Daniel said. "That must be strange." "It would be if we were the same people we were 15 years ago," Olynde replied. "But we're not. He's learned caution. I've learned that truth is more complicated than I thought. We've both grown. Kellen spoke up. My family lost our land 5 years ago. Voss's men showed up with foreclosure papers, said we'd defaulted on a loan we never took out. By the time we proved the documents were forged, the property had been sold to one of Voss's companies, and we had no legal recourse. He stared into the fire. I joined the commander because he's the only one willing to actually fight back. Everyone else just tells us to work through the legal system, but Voss owns the legal system. Similar stories emerged around the fire. Families displaced, properties seized, lives destroyed through legal manipulation, backed by the threat of violence. Every man here had personal stakes in tomorrow's outcome. What happens after? Daniel asked. Say we win tomorrow. Say we take down Voss and prove what he's been doing. Does that get our land back? Does that undo the damage? I don't know, Olynde admitted, but I know that stopping him prevents future damage. That counts for something. It counts for a lot, Kellen said firmly. My family's land is gone, but my sister still lives in the territory with her children. If we stop Voss, maybe they don't lose everything the way we did. Maybe that's enough. Midnight came with clear skies and a half-moon that provided just enough light to move by. Bram's forces separated into 4 groups, each approaching the camp from a different direction. Olynde was assigned to the northern group with Garrett in command, their objective to secure the mining shafts and prevent anyone from using them as escape routes or defensive positions. They moved through the darkness in silence, spreading out into assault positions around the camp's perimeter. Olynde found herself next to a massive piece of mining equipment, some kind of ore crusher that provided excellent cover while offering a clear view of the guard towers. In the camp below, lights burned in a few buildings. Most of the workers had been sent away or confined to quarters. Voss would want only his loyal fighters here when the attack came. That suggested he knew what was happening, had been preparing defenses, would fight rather than surrender, which meant this wouldn't be clean or easy. Dawn was still an hour away when a single shot rang out from the eastern approach. Someone had been spotted, or triggered a tripwire, or simply gotten nervous and fired too early. It didn't matter which, the element of surprise was gone. The camp exploded into activity. Armed men poured from the buildings, taking up defensive positions with practiced speed. The guard towers opened fire toward the eastern approach, where the shot had originated. Bram's forces on that side returned fire, and within seconds, the entire perimeter was engaged. Garrett gave the signal. Olynde and the others surged forward, using the darkness and confusion for cover. They hit the mining equipment area hard, overwhelming the guards there through speed and numbers. 3 defenders went down in the first exchange. The rest fell back toward the central buildings. The fighting was chaotic, flashes of gunfire in darkness, punctuated by shouts and screams. Olynde moved through it with methodical precision, taking shots when targets presented themselves, seeking cover when fire came too close, advancing when opportunities opened. Her body remembered this despite 15 years of disuse, muscle memory from the war years overriding conscious thought. A defender appeared from behind a supply shed, rifle raised. Olynde fired first, saw him stumble and go down. She felt nothing, no triumph, no guilt, just the cold necessity of survival in combat. The northern group pushed deeper into the camp, securing buildings one by one. Resistance was fierce but disorganized. Voss's men were good individually, but lacked the coordinated tactics that Bram's forces demonstrated. They fought defensively, trying to hold positions rather than adapt to changing circumstances. By the time dawn broke properly, Bram's forces controlled most of the camp perimeter. The defenders had fallen back to a core of buildings around the central administrative structure, where they maintained a stubborn defense. Olynde found herself pinned behind a water trough with Kellen and Daniel, trading shots with defenders in the stone building's windows. The construction was solid bullets sparked off the walls without penetrating. This could turn into a prolonged siege if Voss had sufficient supplies inside. Bram appeared at their position, moving in a crouched run that suggested long familiarity with being under fire. "Status? They're dug in solid," Garrett reported. He'd taken a grazing hit to his arm, but was still functional. "That stone building is well defended, and we can't get close enough to force entry without taking heavy casualties." "How many defenders left?" "Maybe 20 inside the main building, another dozen scattered in supporting positions. We've captured or killed the rest." Bram studied the tactical situation, his face grim. "We can't afford a prolonged siege. Every hour we spend here is an hour Voss could be using to call in reinforcements or destroy evidence." "I could try talking to him," Constance suggested. She'd insisted on coming forward despite the danger, her satchel of documents still strapped across her chest. "Voss knows me. I managed his telegraph communications for 6 months before I figured out what he was really doing. He might listen, or he might shoot you," Bram said bluntly. "Possibly, but we need to try something besides direct assault." After a brief debate, Bram agreed. They arranged a temporary ceasefire, calling out terms that were acknowledged from inside the stone building. Constance walked forward with a white cloth tied to a stick, stopping 20 feet from the main entrance. "Colonel Voss," she called, "I know you're in there. I know you remember me from the telegraph office in Millerton. I have documents proving what you've been doing for 15 years, the property seizures, the false intelligence at Crane's Hollow, the kidnapping of Reddick's daughters. It's over. Surrender now, and you'll get a trial. Keep fighting, and you'll die here." Silence from the building. Then a window opened on the second floor, and a man appeared. He was in his 60s, well-dressed, despite the circumstances, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He held a rifle but pointed it at the sky rather than at Constance. "Miss Vale," Voss said, his voice cultured and calm. "Always so dramatic. You have documents, you say? Copies of my correspondence, I presume. Interesting, but hardly admissible in any court that matters. I have friends in the territorial government, judges who owe me favors, officials who understand that development requires hard choices." "The territorial marshal doesn't owe you anything," Constance countered, "and I've already sent copies of everything to his office in the capital. He'll be here within days, with federal authority that supersedes your local influence. Then I suppose we'll see how that plays out." Voss smiled pleasantly. "In the meantime, I have provisions for weeks and defensive positions that would cost you dozens of men to breach. Are you prepared for that mathematics, Reddick?" "Because I am." Bram stepped forward, making himself visible. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to stop you. But let's be honest about what's happening here. Your empire is collapsing. Cordell is in custody and willing to testify against you. Your operations are exposed. Even if you somehow escape today, you're finished in this territory." "Finished?" Voss laughed. "My dear Bram, I've been preparing for this contingency for years. I have resources you can't imagine, properties held through shell companies you'll never trace, money hidden in accounts across 3 territories. Even if you destroy this operation, I rebuild somewhere else. You can't kill an idea, and the idea of development, of progress, of extracting value from wilderness that's eternal." Olynde had been listening from her position behind the water trough. Now she stood and walked forward to join Bram and Constance, making herself visible to Voss. "You remember me, Colonel? Olynde Marrin? I testified at the tribunal 15 years ago." Voss studied her with interest. "Miss Marrin, yes, I remember. Your testimony was quite useful in achieving my objectives. I should thank you." "You orchestrated Crane's Hollow," Olynde said. She kept her voice level, stating facts rather than making accusations. "You provided false intelligence about enemy combatants, knowing it would lead to civilian casualties. You did it to seize property from the families of the children who died. You used my honest testimony to destroy Bram Reddick's career while covering up your own manipulation." "I provided intelligence that seemed credible at the time," Voss corrected. If that intelligence proved flawed, well, such are the uncertainties of war. And yes, I may have benefited from subsequent property transactions. That's called recognizing opportunity. 3 children died, Olynde said. Twin girls named Sullivan, age 8, a boy named Chen, age 9. You planned their deaths like business transactions. I planned to acquire their family's property, Voss replied calmly. The children's deaths were unfortunate, but necessary for the greater good of territorial development. You don't build civilization without breaking a few eggs, Miss Marrin. Surely your military experience taught you that. The casual dismissal of murdered children, the complete lack of remorse, or even acknowledgement of wrongdoing, crystallized something in Olynde. She'd spent 15 years feeling guilty about her role in the tribunal, about testifying against Bram. But standing here listening to Voss reduce children's deaths to broken eggs in service of profit, she understood something fundamental. Truth told in good faith was never wrong, even when evil people used it for evil purposes. Her testimony had been honest and accurate. The fault lay with Voss for manipulating the context, not with her for reporting what she'd witnessed. "You're a monster," she said simply. Voss smiled. "I'm a realist. And a winner. Even today, even surrounded, I'm winning, because every minute you waste talking to me is a minute my people are using to move assets, hide evidence, prepare the next phase. You think this mining camp is my only operation? Think capturing Cordell hurt me? I have 12 Cordells, operations in 5 territories, influence reaching all the way to the federal capital. You've won a battle, Reddick. You haven't won the war." A commotion from inside the building raised voices, the sound of a struggle. Then gunfire, 2 quick shots that seemed to come from inside, rather than being directed outward. The window where Voss had been standing shattered as someone fired from inside. Voss ducked back, cursing, and a new figure appeared in the window. Thomas Reddick. Bram's brother looked older than his years, haggard and desperate. He held a revolver in shaking hands, pointed vaguely in the direction where Voss had disappeared into the building. "Bram," Thomas called. "Bram, I have to explain. Where's Voss?" Bram shouted back. "He went deeper into the building. He has a back exit, a tunnel that leads to the mining shafts. He's escaping." The information galvanized everyone. Bram turned to Garrett. "Take 20 men and seal the mining shaft exits. Don't let Voss get away." To Kellen, "You and your group breach this building. I want everyone inside, captured or neutralized." Forces moved immediately. Olynde found herself part of the breach team, following Kellen through a side door that Thomas had unlocked from the inside. The building's interior was more administrative office than fortress desks, filing cabinets, maps on walls. They cleared it room by room, finding only a handful of defenders who surrendered without fight once they realized the situation. Thomas was in what looked like a record room, surrounded by open cabinets and scattered papers. He'd been crying, his face blotched and miserable. "I'm sorry," he said when Bram entered. "I'm so sorry, Bram. I thought he promised me money, land, a future for my own family. He said your daughters would be safe, that they were just leverage for the property transfer. I didn't think he'd actually—" "Where did he go?" Bram's voice was ice. "The tunnel. Behind the bookshelf there," Thomas pointed with a shaking hand. "It connects to the main mining shaft, comes out about a quarter-mile north of the camp. He has horses waiting." Bram moved the bookshelf aside, revealing a rough-cut passage leading down into darkness. He looked at Olynde, at Kellen, at the others. "I'm going after him. The rest of you secure the building and the prisoners. I'm coming with you," Olynde said. "So am I," Kellen added. Bram didn't argue. He lit a lantern from the desk and led the way into the tunnel, moving quickly despite the rough footing. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, supported by timber beams that looked old and questionable. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air smelled of earth and minerals. They emerged into the main mining shaft, a larger tunnel with rail tracks for ore cars. Lanterns hung at intervals, providing dim illumination. In the distance, they could hear footsteps running, echoing off stone walls. They ran after the sound, boots splashing through, puddles, breathing hard in the thin air. The shaft branched multiple times, but they followed the freshest footprints in the mud, the sound of running that stayed just ahead of them. The tunnel opened suddenly into daylight, the northern exit Thomas had mentioned. Voss was there, mounting a horse that had been tied to a tree. He saw them emerge and spurred the animal immediately, heading up a narrow trail that climbed the hillside. Bram raised his rifle, sighted carefully. "Stop, Voss. There's nowhere to go." Voss turned in the saddle, pulling out a revolver. He fired wildly in their direction. The shots went wide, ricocheting off rocks. Then he was around a bend and out of sight. They ran after him on foot, following the trail upward. It was steep and treacherous, more suited to mountain goats than horses. Ahead, they could hear Voss pushing his mount recklessly, gambling that speed would overcome the danger. The gamble failed. There was a sound of breaking wood, a rotten section, of trail giving way, then a horse's scream and a man shouting. By the time they reached the spot, they found the trail collapsed, the horse struggling at the bottom of a 20-foot drop, and Voss lying in the rocks below. They climbed down carefully. Voss was alive but broken, blood pooling beneath him, breathing in short gasps. The fall had shattered his legs and probably his spine. He looked up as they approached, his cultured composure finally cracked. "Get a doctor," he gasped. "I'll pay anything you want, just get me medical help." Bram knelt beside him. "Where's the evidence? The documents, proving what you've been doing, the records of your operations. Office filing cabinet's combination lock." Voss coughed, blood flecking his lips. "I'll tell you everything, just get me help." Olynde was already examining him with practiced hands. She looked up at Bram and shook her head slightly. "Internal injuries, massive bleeding, damage too severe to survive, even with immediate medical intervention." Voss saw the look, understood it. His expression shifted from desperation to bitter acceptance. "I was building something that would last. Progress, development, civilization. You're destroying that. You were building an empire on murdered children and stolen property," Bram said. "The only thing I'm destroying is your ability to hurt more people." "Same thing," Voss whispered. "Empire, civilization, same thing. You just don't have the stomach for necessary evils." His breathing stopped. His eyes went fixed and empty. Colonel Wendell Voss, architect of 15 years of suffering, died in the rocks below a collapsed trail with his empire crumbling around him. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Bram closed Voss's eyes and straightened. "It's finished," he said quietly. They climbed back up to the trail and began the walk back to the mining camp. Behind them, the horse had stopped struggling, settling into shock or death. The only sound was their footsteps on stone and the wind moving through the pines. When they reached the camp, they found it secure. Voss's remaining men had surrendered once word spread that their leader had fled. Thomas was in custody, alternating between tearful apologies and justifications. Constance was organizing the documents from Voss's office, building the case that would prove everything they'd claimed. Garrett approached with news. "The escort with your daughters is 2 hours out. They'll arrive by noon." Bram's face transformed. The cold commander disappeared, leaving just a father who'd been separated from his children for 3 months and 15 years before that. "They're safe, completely safe, and eager to see you. The battle was over, the war was finished. All that remained was accounting and aftermath." 3 days after the fall of Voss's mining camp, Olynde stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where everything had changed. The camp below was being dismantled. Systematically, equipment catalogued and seized as evidence, buildings marked for demolition or conversion to legitimate mining operations under territorial oversight. The territorial marshal had arrived with federal authority the day before, bringing legitimacy to what might otherwise have been dismissed as vigilante violence. Constance's documents had proven decisive. The letters, the falsified intelligence reports, the property seizure records, all of it painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached back 15 years and touched dozens of families across the territory. The marshal had spent hours reviewing everything, his expression growing progressively darker as he absorbed the scope of Voss's operations. "This will take years to sort out properly," he'd told Bram. "Property rights, legal proceedings, restitution claims, the courts will be tied up for a decade. But the families will get justice?" Bram had pressed. "Eventually, yes. The evidence is overwhelming. We can prove what Voss did, which means we can reverse many of his property seizures. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but justice is possible now." Thomas Reddick was in custody, facing charges for his role in the kidnapping and the broader conspiracy. He'd been cooperative, providing detailed testimony about Voss's operations in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Bram had visited him once in the makeshift jail, a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes and left both brothers looking hollowed out. "I don't think I can forgive him," Bram had told Olynde afterward. "My own brother sold my daughters for money and land. How do you forgive that?" "Maybe you don't," Olynde had replied. "Maybe some betrayals are too fundamental, but you can choose not to let it poison the rest of your life." Cordell was also in custody, singing like a bird about Voss's operations in hopes of avoiding the hangman. His testimony about Crane's Hollow, about the deliberately falsified intelligence, about the planned civilian casualties, about using honest testimony from people like Olynde to cover up the manipulation was being recorded by the territorial court. The official record would be corrected. The children who died would be properly remembered as victims of conspiracy rather than casualties of reckless command decisions. It didn't bring them back. Nothing could do that. But truth mattered, even 15 years late. Olynde heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Ilarion and Junith approaching. The girls looked better than they had 3 days ago, properly fed, rested, wearing clean clothes provided by the territorial marshal's supply wagons. They'd spent most of their time with their father, making up for lost years and processing the trauma of their captivity. "We wanted to thank you," Ilarion said, "for everything, for taking us in, for giving us your horse, for fighting to protect us, and for honoring the promise you made to our mother." Junith added, "Even though you didn't really remember making it." Olynde smiled. "I'm glad I could help. Your mother was a good friend, and she deserved to have her trust honored." "Father says we're going back east," Ilarion said, "to reclaim the family property and rebuild. He wants us to have normal lives, school, all the things we missed." "That sounds wise." "He also says you're welcome to come with us," Junith said, "that you could have a place with our family if you wanted it, a real home instead of a cabin in the wilderness." The offer was genuine and touching, and Olynde was moved by it. But she already knew her answer. "That's kind of him and kind of you, but I think my place is still in the mountains. Maybe not quite as isolated as before, but I'm not ready for towns and settlements yet." "Will we see you again?" Ilarion asked. "I hope so. Your father promised to bring me a horse when everything is settled. I expect he'll bring you along for that visit." The girls hugged her, fierce and warm, then ran back toward the camp where their father waited. Olynde watched them go, feeling the weight of promises kept and obligations fulfilled. Bram found her an hour later, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. He carried something wrapped in cloth, which he set down carefully before sitting next to her on the ridge. "The marshal says the tribunal verdict will be officially reversed," he said without preamble. "My exile order will be lifted, my command record will be corrected to show I was acting on falsified intelligence. 15 years late, but vindication nonetheless. How does that feel? Strange. Satisfying, but strange. I spent so long being angry about the tribunal that I'm not sure what to do now that it's been proven wrong. He looked at her directly. Your testimony will be recontextualized too. The record will show you reported accurately on what you witnessed, and that Voss manipulated the tribunal's interpretation of that testimony. So we're both vindicated. We are. Bram unwrapped the cloth, revealing a new leather bridle, beautifully crafted with brass fittings that gleamed in the late afternoon light. I promised you a horse. This is the bridle. The horse itself is down at the camp, a sturdy mountain mare, 8 years old, good temperament. She's yours, along with tack and supplies sufficient to get you through next winter comfortably. Olynde ran her fingers over the leather, appreciating the craftsmanship. This is too much. It's not enough, but it's what I can give right now. Bram paused. There's something else. Voss's operations included your mountain. The land where you've been living for 15 years has disputed title, and the territorial government is reviewing all of his property claims. They're inclined to grant clear title to anyone who's been living on disputed land for more than 10 years without legal challenge. So the mountain would be mine? Legally? If you want it? You'd have to file formal claims, go through some bureaucratic process. But yes, the land could be yours. Olynde thought about this. 15 years of isolation had been possible, partly because she'd never thought about ownership, about property rights and legal standing. She'd simply existed on the mountain, taking what she needed and leaving no mark beyond her cabin. Owning it formally would change that relationship somehow. I'll think about it, she said finally. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun descended. After a while, Bram spoke again. Marianne used to say that the hardest thing about truth is living with it after you've told it. That honesty has consequences we can't always predict. She was right about that. She was right about you too. She said you were the most honest person she knew, and that honesty was both your greatest strength and your deepest burden. She worried that you'd let it isolate you, that you'd mistake solitude for peace. Olynde felt tears prick her eyes. I did isolate myself. 15 years on that mountain, telling myself I was seeking peace when I was really just hiding from the consequences of telling the truth. But you came down when it mattered, Bram said. When my daughters needed help, when I needed allies, when the truth needed defending, you came down from your mountain and fought. That's what Marianne believed you'd do. That's why she asked you to protect the girls. I didn't do it alone. You brought 200 riders. Constance brought evidence. Dozens of people contributed to stopping Voss. But you were the catalyst. You honored a promise you barely remembered making, and that set everything else in motion. Bram stood, offered his hand to help her up. Come on. There's something I want you to see. He led her down to the camp, to a section that had been set apart from the main activity. A simple wooden cross had been erected there, with names carved into the wood. The Sullivan twins. Chen. The 3 children who'd died at Crane's Hollow 15 years ago. I should have done this years ago, Bram said quietly. Should have honored them properly instead of treating their deaths as tactical mistakes to be analyzed and filed away. They deserved better. They did, Olynde agreed. She thought about the wooden cross she'd carved years ago, sitting on a shelf in her cabin with the same names. We can't bring them back. Can't undo what happened. But we can remember them properly now, in a context where their deaths are attributed to the right person. Voss, she confirmed. They stood together at the memorial, 2 people who'd been used as pawns in a conspiracy that had destroyed lives and twisted truth into service of greed. But they'd survived, and they'd found their way back to something like understanding. As darkness fell, the camp prepared for evening. Fires were lit, meals were cooked, guards were posted. The territorial marshal conducted more interviews, building his case with methodical thoroughness. Thomas sat in his jail wagon, staring at nothing. Cordell provided more testimony, his cultured voice describing horrors in measured tones. And Olynde sat by a fire, with Bram and his daughters, with Kellen and Constance and Garrett, and dozens of others who'd risked everything to fight for justice. They shared food and stories, processing what they'd been through, planning for uncertain futures. "What will you do now?" Constance asked Olynde. "Go back to your mountain?" "Eventually, yes, but maybe not quite as isolated as before. Maybe I'll come down more often, stay connected to the world instead of hiding from it." "You should," Ilarion said firmly. "You're part of our family now. Mother would want you to stay close." Olynde looked at these people, gathered around the fire, people she'd helped, people who'd helped her, people bound together by shared struggle and hard-won truth. For 15 years, she'd told herself that isolation was safety, that distance protected her from the pain of consequences. But sitting here now, surrounded by human warmth and connection, she understood what Marianne had tried to tell her all those years ago. Truth was meant to be told in community, not isolation. Honesty was meant to connect people, not separate them. The consequences of speaking truthfully might be painful, but they were meant to be borne together. 2 days later, when the territorial marshal departed with his prisoners and evidence, Olynde prepared to return to her mountain. Bram gave her the mare he'd promised, along with supplies and the assurance that he'd visit once the property issues were settled. His daughters hugged her goodbye with promises to write, to visit, to stay connected. The ride back to her cabin took 2 days, following familiar trails through country she knew intimately. The mare was everything Bram had promised, steady, calm, responsive to gentle guidance. Having a horse again changed something fundamental. She was no longer trapped by her choices, no longer committed to isolation by necessity. She could choose to stay or choose to leave, could maintain her solitude or seek connection as circumstances and desire dictated. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it, the note she'd written still sitting on the table, weighted with a stone. She removed it, crumpled it, fed it to the fire she built in the hearth. She wouldn't need instructions for who got her property if she didn't return. She had every intention of returning now, as many times as necessary. She spent the evening organizing her supplies, making plans for winter, thinking about the future. The locket Marianne had sent through her daughters sat on the shelf next to the wooden cross with the children's names. Reminders of promises kept and debts honored, of truth told and consequences accepted. As darkness fell and the mountain settled into its familiar quiet, Olynde stood at her window with a cup of coffee and looked out over the wilderness that had been her refuge. It was still beautiful, still peaceful, still capable of sustaining her. But it was no longer a hiding place. It was simply home, a place she could return to by choice rather than necessity, a sanctuary she could leave knowing she had the strength and will to come back. She thought about the title claim Bram had mentioned, about making her ownership of this land official and legal. Maybe she would file those papers, establish her right to be here not through isolation but through legitimate presence. Maybe she'd even build a second cabin, a place where visitors could stay, where Ilarion and Junith could come in summers, where connection could be maintained without sacrificing the solitude she still needed. The mountain had saved her 15 years ago, had given her space to process guilt and grief and the weight of truth told at great cost. But she'd learned through Marianne's daughters and Bram's struggle and Voss's conspiracy that mountains weren't meant to be permanent prisons. They were meant to be places of refuge and renewal, places you could retreat to and return from, places that offered perspective without demanding isolation. She raised her cup to the darkness, to the mountain, to Marianne's memory and her daughter's future and the truth that had finally been told in its proper context. Then she turned back to her cabin, to the warmth of her fire and the comfort of her simple possessions and the knowledge that she was exactly where she needed to be. Not hiding, not running, just living, with the mountain as witness and the world within reach whenever she chose to descend and engage with it. The hardest thing she'd ever done was give away the one thing standing between her and certain death. But sometimes sacrifice opens doors that self-protection keeps locked. Sometimes giving everything away is how you find out what really matters. She'd given her horse to two lost girls because a dying woman had asked her to 15 years ago, in a promise she'd barely remembered. That simple act of honoring forgotten words had led to vindication, to justice, to the correction of historical lies and the exposure of conspiracy. It had led her back to the world, back to connection, back to the understanding that truth told in good faith was always worth the cost, even when the consequences took 15 years to fully unfold. The mountains stood eternal around her cabin, solid and unchanging. But Olynde Marrin had changed, and that change, hard-won and dearly bought, was the real victory of these past weeks. She was no longer the woman who'd fled to isolation, carrying guilt like chains. She was the woman who'd honored a promise, protected the innocent, fought for truth, and found her way back to connection without losing herself. That woman could live on this mountain or leave it, could maintain solitude or seek company, could speak truth or hold silence, all as conscious choices rather than fearful compulsions. That woman was free. And freedom, she was discovering, was worth every sacrifice required to achieve it.